The story of America's involvement in Vietnam doesn't begin in the 1960s, as many believe. It begins decades earlier, in the dying days of the Second World War, when the world order was being redrawn and the seeds of a new kind of conflict were being planted in the jungles of Southeast Asia. To understand how the United States became entangled in its longest and most controversial war, we must first travel back to a time when Vietnam was still a French colony, and a young revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh was beginning his lifelong quest for Vietnamese independence. Vietnam had been under French colonial rule since the 1860s, part of French Indochina that also included Laos and Cambodia. For nearly a century, the Vietnamese people had lived under foreign domination, their resources exploited, their culture suppressed, and their aspirations for self-determination crushed beneath the boot of European imperialism. But the Second World War would change everything when Nazi Germany conquered France in 1940. The French colonial administration in Vietnam suddenly found itself vulnerable and weakened. Japan, seeking to expand its empire throughout Asia, moved quickly to take advantage of this situation. In September 1940, Japanese forces occupied Vietnam, though they initially allowed the French colonial government to remain in nominal control. This arrangement lasted until March 1945, when the Japanese, sensing their imminent defeat in the Pacific War, decided to take full control. They dissolved the French colonial administration and encouraged Vietnamese nationalists to declare independence. It was during this chaotic period that Ho Chi Minh saw his opportunity. He had been fighting for Vietnamese independence since the 1920s, traveling from Paris to Moscow to China, learning revolutionary tactics and building a network of supporters. Now with both the French and Japanese weakened, he moved to fill the power vacuum. Ho Chi Minh was born Nguyen Sinh Cung in 1890 in central Vietnam. The son of a Confucian scholar and teacher, he grew up witnessing the injustices of French colonial rule firsthand. As a young man, he left Vietnam working as a cook on a French steamer ship that took him to ports around the world. In Paris, he became involved in socialist politics and was deeply influenced by the writings of Lenin. He attended the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, hoping to petition the Allied powers to grant independence to Vietnam, but he was ignored. This rejection would shape his political trajectory for the rest of his life. By the 1930s, Ho Chi Minh had become a committed communist revolutionary. He founded the Indochinese Communist Party in 1930 and spent years organizing resistance movements against French rule. When the Japanese occupied Vietnam, he saw it as a temporary setback but also an opportunity. He understood that the end of the war would bring a moment of uncertainty, a brief window when Vietnam's future would be up for grabs. He was determined that when that moment came, he and his followers would be ready. The organization Ho Chi Minh built was called the Viet Minh, short for the League for the Independence of Vietnam. Founded in 1941, the Viet Minh was officially a broad nationalist coalition, but it was controlled and directed by the Communist Party. During the war, the Viet Minh waged a guerrilla campaign against the Japanese occupiers, and they did something remarkable that would have profound consequences for the future. They allied themselves with the United States. American OSS agents, the predecessors to the CIA, parachuted into the Vietnamese jungle to work with Ho Chi Minh's forces. The Americans provided weapons, training, and intelligence, helping the Viet Minh fight the Japanese. In return, the Viet Minh rescued downed American pilots and provided valuable information about Japanese positions. This alliance was pragmatic for both sides. The Americans needed all the help they could get fighting Japan, and they weren't particularly concerned about the politics of their local allies. For Ho Chi Minh, the alliance was an opportunity to gain weapons, experience, and perhaps most importantly, American goodwill. He believed that if Vietnam helped America win the war, America would support Vietnamese independence afterward. He admired the American Revolution and the principles of self-determination, outlined in the Atlantic Charter and the United Nations Charter. He even quoted the American Declaration of Independence in his own Declaration of Vietnamese Independence. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Ho Chi Minh moved quickly. On September 2, 1945, he stood before a crowd of hundreds of thousands in Hanoi and declared Vietnam's independence. The speech he gave that day began with words deliberately chosen to appeal to American sensibilities. "All men are created equal," he proclaimed. "They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." He was quoting Thomas Jefferson, and it was not an accident. Ho Chi Minh genuinely believed that America, having fought for its own independence from colonial rule, would understand and support Vietnam's struggle for freedom. But Ho Chi Minh had fundamentally misunderstood the new world order that was emerging from the ashes of World War II. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union was already beginning to fracture. Winston Churchill would soon deliver his famous Iron Curtain speech, warning of Soviet expansion in Europe. In Washington, American policymakers were increasingly viewing the world through the lens of the emerging Cold War. Communism was no longer seen as just another political ideology. It was viewed as an existential threat to the American way of life and to global stability. And Ho Chi Minh, despite his admiration for American ideals, was undeniably a communist. At the same time, France was desperate to reassert its status as a great power after the humiliation of Nazi occupation. The French saw their colonial empire, particularly Indochina, as essential to their national prestige and economic recovery. They were not about to simply let Vietnam go, regardless of what the Vietnamese people wanted. The British, who had been given responsibility for accepting the Japanese surrender in southern Vietnam, helped facilitate the return of French forces. By the end of 1945, French troops were back in Saigon, and it was clear that France intended to reclaim its colony. Initially, there were attempts at negotiation. In March 1946, Ho Chi Minh signed an agreement with France that recognized Vietnam as a free state within the French Union, whatever that meant. But the agreement was vague and open to interpretation, and neither side was truly satisfied. Tensions escalated throughout 1946, with incidents of violence becoming more frequent. The breaking point came in November, when French naval forces bombarded the port city of Haiphong, killing thousands of Vietnamese civilians. In December, the Viet Minh launched attacks on French positions in Hanoi. The First Indochina War had begun. For the next 8 years, France would fight a brutal colonial war trying to maintain control of Vietnam. It was a war that France could not afford and ultimately could not win. The Viet Minh, led by the brilliant military strategist Vo Nguyen Giap, waged a classic guerrilla campaign. They avoided large-scale confrontations with superior French forces, instead focusing on ambushes, raids, and attacks on supply lines. They melted into the countryside and enjoyed widespread support among the rural population. The French, meanwhile, found themselves fighting an enemy they could rarely see and could never seem to defeat decisively. As the war dragged on, the French became increasingly desperate for American support. They framed the conflict not as a colonial war, but as a fight against communist expansion. This argument resonated in Washington. The victory of Mao Zedong's communist forces in China in 1949 had shocked American policymakers. The Korean War, which began in 1950, seemed to confirm that communism was aggressively expanding throughout Asia. American officials began to view Vietnam through this Cold War lens. The domino theory was born. The idea that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, others would quickly follow, like a row of dominoes toppling over. By 1950, the United States was paying for approximately 80% of France's war effort in Vietnam. American military advisors were being sent to assist the French. The United States was now indirectly involved in the conflict, not because of any vital American interests in Vietnam itself, but because of broader Cold War concerns about containing communism. The irony was profound. Ho Chi Minh had admired America and hoped for American support. But American Cold War fears and alliance with France had put the United States on the opposite side. The stage was being set for a tragedy that would consume both nations. By 1953, the French position in Vietnam was deteriorating rapidly. Despite massive American financial support and 8 years of fighting, France was no closer to victory than it had been at the start of the war. The French public was wary of the conflict, which the press had begun calling the Dirty War. French casualties were mounting, with over 90,000 soldiers killed or wounded, and there seemed to be no end in sight. The Viet Minh, meanwhile, had grown stronger and more sophisticated. With support from newly communist China and the Soviet Union, they now possessed modern weapons and had evolved from a ragtag guerrilla force into a disciplined army capable of conventional operations. General Vo Nguyen Giap, who had studied the campaigns of Napoleon and the tactics of Mao Zedong, was proving to be a military genius who understood how to blend guerrilla warfare with conventional tactics. In November 1953, the French commander in Indochina, General Henry Navarre, decided on a bold strategy that he believed would finally bring the Viet Minh to battle and destroy them. He ordered the establishment of a fortified base in a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam near the border with Laos. The location was called Dien Bien Phu. Navarre's plan was to use this base as bait to lure the Viet Minh into a major battle where superior French firepower, including artillery and air support, would annihilate them. The base was positioned to block Viet Minh supply routes into Laos and to serve as a strongpoint for operations in the region. French paratroopers were dropped into the valley in an operation called Casta, and they quickly set about building fortifications and airstrips. The French commanders were confident, perhaps overconfident. They believed that the Viet Minh lacked the capability to attack such a well-defended position, and even if they did attack, they would be destroyed. What the French failed to appreciate was the extraordinary determination and ingenuity of their enemy. When Giap learned of the French position at Dien Bien Phu, he saw it not as a threat but as an opportunity. The French had placed a large force in an isolated valley, surrounded by hills, dependent entirely on air supply. Giap began planning one of the most remarkable military operations of the 20th century. He would bring his army, along with heavy artillery, through hundreds of miles of jungle and mountains to surround Dien Bien Phu. Then he would lay siege to the base and destroy it. The challenges were immense. The Viet Minh would need to move over 50,000 troops plus heavy artillery pieces through terrain that the French considered impassable. They would need to establish supply lines through the jungle to keep their forces fed and armed during a prolonged siege. And they would need to do all of this without being detected by French reconnaissance aircraft. Beginning in December 1953, an incredible feat of logistics and human endurance began. Tens of thousands of Viet Minh soldiers and civilian porters began the march to Dien Bien Phu. They pushed artillery pieces through the jungle, literally hauling them up mountains by hand. They built roads where none existed, camouflaging them with foliage to hide them from French aircraft. Supply trains of thousands of bicycles, each loaded with hundreds of pounds of rice and ammunition, made their way through the jungle trails. The entire operation was conducted at night and under cover of jungle canopy. The French detected some of this activity, but they severely underestimated its scale. They believed the Viet Minh might have a few artillery pieces, but nothing that could seriously threaten the base. By March 1954, Giap had surrounded Dien Bien Phu with 5 divisions, approximately 50,000 men. More importantly, he had positioned heavy artillery in the hills overlooking the valley, including anti-aircraft guns that would prove crucial in the coming battle. The French still had about 16,000 men in the valley, with strong fortifications and the support of aircraft, but they were about to receive a terrible shock. On March 13th, the Viet Minh opened fire with a massive artillery barrage. The French were stunned. Not only did the Viet Minh have far more artillery than anyone had believed possible, but they had positioned it expertly on the reverse slopes of hills, making it nearly impossible for French counter-battery fire to destroy. The Viet Minh guns systematically destroyed the French airstrip, making it impossible for aircraft to land. From that moment on, the French garrison could only be resupplied by parachute drop, and Viet Minh anti-aircraft fire made even that extremely dangerous. The battle for Dien Bien Phu became a grinding siege. The Viet Minh dug trenches closer and closer to the French positions, a tactic reminiscent of World War I. They launched human wave attacks that suffered horrific casualties but gradually overran the outer French strongpoints one by one. The French positions had been given women's names by the base commander, Colonel Christian de Castries. Beatrice fell first, then Gabrielle, then Anne-Marie. Each victory brought the Viet Minh closer to the center of the French position. Inside the perimeter, conditions became nightmarish. The French were subjected to constant artillery bombardment. The wounded piled up in inadequate medical facilities. Supplies ran short. Monsoon rains turned the valley into a sea of mud, and overhead Viet Minh anti-aircraft fire made resupply increasingly difficult and costly. The French government watched the battle with growing alarm. They appealed to the United States for direct military intervention. This request sparked intense debate within the Eisenhower administration. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and Vice President Richard Nixon were among those who advocated for American intervention, possibly including the use of nuclear weapons. Admiral Arthur Radford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, proposed Operation Vulture, a plan for massive American airstrikes to relieve the siege. Some discussions even included the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons against the Viet Minh positions. President Eisenhower was more cautious. He insisted that any American intervention would require support from Congress and from allies, particularly Britain. When British Prime Minister Winston Churchill refused to support intervention, and when congressional leaders expressed skepticism about another war in Asia so soon after Korea, Eisenhower decided against direct military action. Without American intervention, the fate of Dien Bien Phu was sealed. By early May, the French position had become hopeless. The perimeter had been reduced to a small area under constant bombardment and assault. On May 7, 1954, after 56 days of siege, the French garrison surrendered. It was a catastrophic defeat. Over 2,000 French soldiers had been killed and nearly 12,000 were taken prisoner. Many of these prisoners would not survive the brutal forced marches to prison camps for the Viet Minh. Victory came at an enormous cost as well, with an estimated 23,000 casualties. But it was a decisive strategic victory that broke French will to continue the war. The fall of Dien Bien Phu shocked the world. It was the first time in the modern era that an Asian army had defeated a European colonial power in a major conventional battle. The myth of Western military invincibility in Asia was shattered. In France, the government fell, and the new government committed to seeking peace. An international conference that had been planned to discuss the Korean War in Indochina was already underway in Geneva, Switzerland. With the defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the French position at the negotiating table was fatally weakened. They had no choice but to accept terms that would end their colonial presence in Indochina. The Geneva Conference of 1954 brought together representatives from France, the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and the various Vietnamese factions. The negotiations were complex and contentious, but eventually, agreements were reached. Vietnam would be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh's government would control the north, while a non-communist government would control the south. This division was supposed to be temporary. The Geneva Accords called for nationwide elections to be held in July 1956 to reunify the country under a single government. Both zones were to refrain from joining military alliances or allowing foreign military bases on their territory. An international control commission would supervise the implementation of the agreements. The accords also provided for a 300-day period during which people could freely move between North and South Vietnam. This provision led to a massive population transfer. Nearly 1 million people, the majority of them Catholic, fled from North Vietnam to the south. Many were motivated by fear of communist rule and by effective propaganda, some of it sponsored by the CIA, warning of persecution and bloodshed under Ho Chi Minh's government. The Catholic Church played a significant role in organizing this exodus. In the other direction, perhaps 90,000 Viet Minh fighters and supporters moved from south to north, though tens of thousands of Viet Minh cadres stayed behind in the south, going underground to wait for the promised elections. The United States did not sign the Geneva Accords, though it pledged to respect them. In reality, American policymakers had no intention of allowing the elections called for in the Accords to take place. President Eisenhower himself later wrote in his memoirs that if the elections had been held in 1956, Ho Chi Minh would have won perhaps 80% of the vote. The Americans could not accept a communist victory, even a democratic one. They had a different vision for South Vietnam. They would build it into a strong, independent, anti-communist nation that would serve as a bulwark against communist expansion in Southeast Asia. They would provide massive economic and military aid. And they had found their man to lead this new nation, a Vietnamese nationalist named Ngo Dinh Diem, who had been living in exile in the United States and who seemed to share American values and anti-communist convictions. The French were leaving Vietnam, but the Americans were stepping in to take their place. The war was not over. In fact, it was just beginning. Ngo Dinh Diem was an unlikely figure to become the founding father of South Vietnam. Born in 1891 into a devout Catholic family in central Vietnam, Diem was a fervent nationalist who had opposed both French colonial rule and the communist Viet Minh. He had briefly served in the French colonial administration in the 1930s, but resigned in protest over French policies. During World War II, he refused to cooperate with either the Japanese or Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh. After the war, Ho Chi Minh actually offered Diem a position in his government, hoping to build a broad nationalist coalition, but Diem refused. Deeply opposed to communism on both political and religious grounds, his brother had been killed by the Viet Minh, which only hardened his anti-communist stance. By the early 1950s, Diem was living in exile, spending time in the United States where he developed connections with influential American politicians and Catholic leaders. When the Geneva Accords divided Vietnam, the Americans needed someone to lead. South Vietnam, who was both nationalist enough to have credibility with the Vietnamese people and reliably anti-communist, Diem seemed to fit the bill. He was strongly backed by several influential Americans, including Cardinal Francis Spellman of New York and Senators Mike Mansfield and John F. Kennedy. In June 1954, the French-backed Emperor Bo Dai, who nominally ruled South Vietnam, appointed Diem as prime minister. It was a position that Diem would use to consolidate power far beyond what anyone initially anticipated. He arrived in Saigon to face a country in chaos. South Vietnam was not really a nation at all, but rather a collection of competing factions and interests. The French were still present and reluctant to cede control. The Vietnamese National Army was weak and poorly trained. Much of the countryside was controlled by various armed religious sects and criminal organizations that operated as virtual private armies. The most powerful of these groups were the Cao Dai and Ho Hao religious sects, which together commanded perhaps 40,000 armed followers, and the Bin Dien, a criminal organization that controlled much of Saigon's vice trade and even operated the National Police Force, which they had purchased from Emperor Bo Dai. These groups had their own armies, collected their own taxes, and operated independently of any central authority. Additionally, there were the Viet Minh cadres who had remained in the south, waiting for the elections that were supposed to reunify the country. Diem faced enormous challenges, and few observers gave him much chance of survival. The French considered him a troublesome fanatic. The CIA station chief in Saigon, Edward Lansdale, initially recommended against supporting him. Even American officials who had backed his appointment had serious doubts about his ability to govern. But Diem proved to be far tougher and more ruthless than anyone expected. With American support and Lansdale's eventual assistance, he moved systematically to crush his rivals and consolidate power. In March 1955, fighting broke out between government forces and the Bin Dien in Saigon. It was brutal urban warfare that left hundreds dead and parts of the city in ruins. Diem's forces, backed by loyal army units, eventually prevailed. The Bin Dien were destroyed as a military force, and their leaders fled into exile or were killed. Next, Diem turned on the Cao Dai and Ho Hao sects through a combination of military force, bribery, and political maneuvering. He broke their power and brought their territories under government control. Thousands were killed in these campaigns, but by the end of 1955, Diem had established himself as the unquestioned ruler of South Vietnam. In October 1955, Diem organized a referendum to decide whether South Vietnam should remain a monarchy under Emperor Bo Dai or become a republic with Diem as president. The referendum was thoroughly fraudulent. In some districts, Diem received more votes than there were registered voters. The official result claimed that Diem won 98% of the vote. Even American advisors were embarrassed by the obvious fraud, but Diem was now president of the newly proclaimed Republic of Vietnam. The Americans accepted this outcome because Diem had proven himself effective at consolidating power and maintaining an anti-communist government, whatever his faults, and they were becoming increasingly apparent. He was their man in Saigon. With American aid pouring in, Diem set about building a nation. Hundreds of millions of dollars in economic and military assistance flowed into South Vietnam. The Americans helped build roads, schools, and hospitals. They trained and equipped the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. They sent advisors to help establish government ministries and train civil servants. On paper, South Vietnam was making remarkable progress. The economy was growing, refugees from the north were being resettled, a new constitution was written. To many Americans, it seemed that the experiment was working. South Vietnam was being transformed into a modern, prosperous, democratic nation that would serve as a model for all of Southeast Asia. Time magazine put Diem on its cover, hailing him as a miracle worker. But beneath the surface, serious problems were developing. Diem was a micromanager who trusted almost no one outside his immediate family. Power became increasingly concentrated in the hands of Diem and his brothers, particularly Ngo Dinh Diem, who served as his chief political advisor, and Archbishop Ngo Dinh Thuc, who wielded enormous influence as the leading Catholic president. Diem's government became notorious for nepotism and corruption. His family members and loyal Catholics were given the best positions, even when they were incompetent. Meanwhile, the Buddhist majority, which made up roughly 80% of the population, felt increasingly marginalized. Diem, a devout Catholic, showed favoritism toward Catholic refugees from the north, and often appointed Catholics to positions of authority over Buddhist populations. Diem's authoritarianism grew more pronounced over time. He banned opposition political parties. He shut down critical newspapers. He imprisoned thousands of political opponents, many of whom were not communists but simply people who disagreed with his policies. His notorious Law 10 of 1956 allowed the government to jail anyone deemed dangerous to the state without trial. Thousands were sent to re-education camps. His brother Nhu organized the Can Lao, a secret political party that functioned as an intelligence and security apparatus, spying on everyone including government officials and army officers. The Can Lao created a climate of fear and paranoia. Officers and officials were afraid to show initiative or express opinions that might be reported. Loyalty to the Diem family became more important than competence. The promised elections to reunify Vietnam, scheduled for July 1956 under the Geneva Accords, never happened. Diem refused to participate, arguing that free elections were impossible in the communist north and that South Vietnam had not signed the Geneva Accords and therefore was not bound by them. The United States fully supported this position. American officials knew that Ho Chi Minh would almost certainly win any nationwide election, and they were not about to allow South Vietnam to be handed over to the communists through the ballot box. From the American perspective, South Vietnam was now a sovereign nation, allied with the United States, and there was no reason it should have to submit to elections that would result in communist rule. From the perspective of many Vietnamese, both North and South, this was a betrayal of the Geneva Accords and proof that the Americans were simply replacing the French as foreign overlords. In North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh's government consolidated its control and set about building a communist state. They implemented land reform programs that were often brutal and chaotic, resulting in the execution of thousands of landlords and rich peasants. There were excesses and atrocities that even the North Vietnamese government later acknowledged and apologized for. The North received substantial aid from the Soviet Union and China. They built their military forces and developed heavy industry, but they also waited to see what would happen in the South. Initially, Ho Chi Minh counseled patience. He believed that Diem's government would collapse on its own, that the scheduled elections would eventually take place, and that reunification could be achieved peacefully. He ordered the Viet Minh cadres who had stayed in the South to avoid military action and focus on political organizing. But by the late 1950s, it was becoming clear that Diem was not going to collapse, that the elections were never going to happen, and that the Americans were committed to maintaining a separate South Vietnamese state indefinitely. The Viet Minh cadres in the South, now increasingly referred to as Viet Cong by the Diem government, were being hunted down and killed by Diem's security forces. Thousands were arrested or executed. The Viet Cong were desperate in facing annihilation. They began to strike back, assassinating government officials and attacking army outposts. Initially, these actions were taken without authorization from Hanoi, but gradually North Vietnam decided that armed struggle was necessary. In 1959, North Vietnam formally authorized the resumption of armed revolution in the South. The war was beginning again, though it would be years before most Americans realized it. The trail that would become famous as the Ho Chi Minh Trail was established in 1959, a network of paths and roads running through Laos and Cambodia that would be used to infiltrate supplies and soldiers into South Vietnam. The first North Vietnamese soldiers began moving south along this route. In December 1960, the National Liberation Front was established, a political organization that would serve as the public face of the revolution in the South. The NLF presented itself as a broad nationalist coalition seeking to overthrow the Diem dictatorship and achieve Vietnamese independence and reunification. While it included non-communists, it was controlled and directed by the Communist Party, just as the Viet Minh had been. The NLF's military arm was the People's Liberation Armed Forces, but everyone, including the Americans, simply called them the Viet Cong. By 1961, South Vietnam was facing a growing insurgency. The Viet Cong were assassinating village chiefs, attacking military outposts, and ambushing government forces with increasing frequency. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, despite years of American training and massive quantities of American equipment, was proving ineffective. Corruption was rampant. Officers often owed their positions to political connections rather than military ability. Soldiers were poorly motivated and often brutalized their own people. The government in Saigon seemed increasingly disconnected from the rural population where most Vietnamese lived. Diem rarely left the presidential palace and seemed oblivious to the problems afflicting his country. When John F. Kennedy became President of the United States in January 1961, he inherited this deteriorating situation. Kennedy was a Cold War liberal who believed in containing communism but also believed in new approaches to counterinsurgency and nation-building. He would have to decide whether to increase American commitment to South Vietnam or risk letting it fall to the communists. The decision he made would set the United States on a path toward its longest war. John Fitzgerald Kennedy came to the presidency in January 1961 with a mandate for change and a belief that America needed to confront the challenges of the Cold War with new energy and new strategies. At 43, he was the youngest elected president in American history, and he brought with him a generation of advisors who believed they could apply rational analysis and modern management techniques to solve any problem, including the problem of communist insurgency in the developing world. Kennedy had been critical of the Eisenhower administration's heavy reliance on nuclear weapons and massive retaliation. He believed America needed a strategy of flexible response, the ability to fight limited wars and counterinsurgencies as well as nuclear conflicts. Vietnam would become the testing ground for these theories. Kennedy inherited a world in crisis. Just months into his presidency, the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba ended in humiliating failure. In June, he met with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna, and the meeting went badly. Khrushchev blustered and threatened over Berlin. Kennedy left Vienna convinced that Khrushchev saw him as weak and inexperienced. The Soviet leaders seemed to believe he could push the young president around. Kennedy was determined to prove him wrong. He needed to show strength and resolve somewhere in the world. Vietnam provided that opportunity. When Kennedy took office, there were roughly 700 American military advisors in South Vietnam. The insurgency was growing, and the Diem government appeared to be losing control of the countryside. Kennedy's advisors were divided on what to do. Some, like Ambassador to India John Kenneth Galbraith and Under-Secretary of State George Bull, warned that Vietnam was a quagmire that America should avoid. They argued that South Vietnam was not a vital American interest and that supporting Diem's corrupt and unpopular regime was a mistake. But these voices were in the minority. Most of Kennedy's advisors, including Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, and the military leadership, argued for increased American commitment. They believed in the domino theory. They believed that if South Vietnam fell to communism, all of Southeast Asia would follow. They believed that American credibility was at stake, that allies around the world were watching to see if America would stand by its commitments, and they believed that with American know-how and resources, South Vietnam could be saved. In October 1961, Kennedy sent General Maxwell Taylor and Walt Rostow on a fact-finding mission to South Vietnam. They returned with a recommendation for a major increase in American involvement, including the deployment of American combat troops. Kennedy was reluctant to send combat forces. He had learned from the Bay of Pigs that military operations could spiral out of control. He was also aware that sending American soldiers to fight in Asia was politically risky. But he was willing to dramatically increase the number of American advisors and to provide more equipment and support to the South Vietnamese forces. Over the next 2 years, the American presence in South Vietnam exploded. By the end of 1963, there would be over 16,000 American military personnel in Vietnam, a 20-fold increase from when Kennedy took office. These American advisors were not supposed to engage in combat. Officially, their role was to train and advise the South Vietnamese military, but the line between advising and fighting was often blurred. American helicopter pilots flew South Vietnamese troops into combat and provided close air support. American advisors accompanied South Vietnamese units on operations. Americans were dying. The first American soldier killed in Vietnam under Kennedy's watch was Specialist James T. Davis, shot in December 1961 during a Viet Cong ambush. He would not be the last. The Kennedy administration sold the American public on the idea that this was a limited commitment, that Americans were there to help the South Vietnamese help themselves, and that success was just around the corner. But privately, some of Kennedy's advisors were beginning to have doubts. The problem was that the South Vietnamese military, despite all the American aid and training, was not winning. The Viet Cong continued to grow stronger. They controlled large portions of the countryside, particularly in the Mekong Delta. They moved freely at night and could strike almost anywhere. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, known by its acronym ARVN, seemed incapable of dealing with them. ARVN units were often poorly led and unwilling to take casualties. There were exceptions, brave and capable ARVN units and commanders, but they were not the norm. Corruption remained endemic. American weapons and equipment often ended up on the black market or in Viet Cong hands, and the Diem government's policies were often counterproductive, alienating the very people they were supposed to be winning over. One of the most controversial programs was the Strategic Hamlet program. The theory behind it seemed sound. The idea was to relocate rural Vietnamese into fortified villages where they could be protected from the Viet Cong, and where the government could provide services and win their loyalty. It was based loosely on successful British counterinsurgency tactics in Malaya. American officials loved it because it was quantifiable. You could count how many strategic hamlets had been established and report progress. By 1963, the Diem government claimed to have established over 8,000 strategic hamlets housing millions of people. On paper, it looked like a tremendous success. In reality, it was a disaster. Vietnamese peasants did not want to leave their ancestral lands and villages. They were often forced to move at gunpoint. They were made to build the fortifications themselves without compensation. The promised government services rarely materialized. Many strategic hamlets were poorly defended and easily overrun by the Viet Cong rather than winning hearts and minds. The program generated enormous resentment and drove many Vietnamese into the arms of the Viet Cong. Another problem was the growing rift between the Diem government and the Buddhist majority. Diem's favoritism toward Catholics and his authoritarian rule had long been sources of tension. But in 1963, this tension exploded into crisis. On May 8, 1963, government forces fired into a crowd of Buddhists in the city of Hue who were protesting a ban on displaying Buddhist flags on Buddha's birthday. 9 people were killed, including children. Rather than apologizing or investigating, Diem's government blamed the Viet Cong and refused to take responsibility. This sparked a wave of Buddhist protests across South Vietnam. The monks organized demonstrations, hunger strikes, and acts of civil disobedience. The Diem government responded with arrests and crackdowns. On June 11, 1963, something happened that shocked the world and changed the course of the war. A Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc sat down at a busy Saigon intersection, assumed the lotus position, and was doused with gasoline by fellow monks. He then lit a match and set himself on fire. As flames engulfed him, he remained perfectly still in meditation until his body collapsed. American journalist Malcolm Brown photographed the self-immolation, and the image was transmitted around the world. It appeared on the front page of newspapers everywhere. President Kennedy saw it and reportedly said that no news picture in history had generated so much emotion around the world as that one. The photograph showed the world that something was profoundly wrong in South Vietnam, that the government America was supporting was so oppressive that monks were burning themselves to death in protest. Diem's response to the crisis made things worse. His brother Ngo and Ngo's wife, the notorious Madame Ngo, mocked the self-immolations. Madame Ngo called them barbecues and offered to provide the gasoline for more. Such callousness was shocking even to American officials who had been defending the Diem regime. In August, Ngo ordered raids on Buddhist pagodas across South Vietnam. Hundreds of monks were arrested and beaten. Several were killed. The raids were carried out by Vietnamese special forces, who were trained and funded by the CIA, which created enormous embarrassment for the United States. The American ambassador, Frederick Nulting, who had been a strong supporter of Diem, happened to be on vacation when the raids occurred. When he returned and learned what had happened, he realized his policy of unwavering support for Diem was no longer tenable. In Washington, the Kennedy administration was deeply divided over what to do about Diem. Some officials, particularly in the State Department, believed that Diem had to go, that he had become a liability, and that the United States needed to support a military coup to replace him with more competent and less repressive leadership. Others, particularly in the military and CIA, argued that Diem, for all his faults, was preferable to the chaos and uncertainty that might follow a coup. Kennedy himself was conflicted. He knew that Diem was a problem, but he worried about what might come after him. There was a real risk that a coup could lead to instability that would make things worse, not better. But the situation was deteriorating rapidly. More monks were immolating themselves. The Buddhist crisis was spiraling out of control. The Viet Cong were gaining ground, and American casualties were mounting. The new American ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, arrived in Saigon in August 1963 and quickly concluded that Diem had to be removed. Lodge was a prominent Republican, a former senator and vice presidential candidate, and Kennedy had appointed him partly to give his Vietnam policy bipartisan cover. Lodge began making contact with South Vietnamese generals who were plotting a coup. He signaled that the United States would not oppose a change in government. This was a momentous decision. The United States was effectively giving a green light to the overthrow of an allied government. Kennedy approved a carefully worded cable that indicated American support for a coup, though he later seemed to have second thoughts and sent conflicting signals. The mixed messages from Washington created confusion, and an initial coup plot in late August fell apart, but the plotting continued. Several ARVN generals, led by General Duong Van Minh, were determined to remove Diem. They established contact with CIA officer Lucien Conine, who served as the liaison between the plotters and the American embassy. Ambassador Lodge assured the generals that the United States would not interfere with a coup and would recognize a new government if it showed itself capable of governing effectively. On November 1st, 1963, the generals made their move. ARVN units seized key locations in Saigon. The presidential palace was surrounded. Diem and his brother Ngo called Lodge and asked what the American position was. Lodge told Diem that he was concerned for his physical safety and offered to help him leave the country. Diem refused. He and Ngo escaped from the palace through a secret tunnel and took refuge in a Catholic church in the Chinese quarter of Saigon. The next morning, November 2nd, the brothers agreed to surrender. An armored personnel carrier was sent to pick them up. What happened next remains somewhat unclear, though the outcome is not in dispute. Diem and Ngo were placed in the personnel carrier with their hands tied behind their backs. On the way back to military headquarters, both men were shot multiple times and stabbed. When their bodies arrived at headquarters, they were barely recognizable. Official accounts claimed they had committed suicide, but this was obviously false. They had been murdered, likely on orders from the coup leaders who feared that if Diem and Ngo remained alive, they might somehow return to power. When Kennedy was informed of the deaths, he was reportedly shocked and upset. Whatever he had intended, he had not wanted Diem killed. The United States had helped engineer the overthrow of the Diem government, and now the leaders of that government were dead. The coup did not solve South Vietnam's problems. In fact, it made them worse. The new military government proved unstable and ineffective. There would be a series of coups and countercoups over the next 2 years as different generals jockeyed for power. The political chaos distracted from the war effort and allowed the Viet Cong to make significant gains. 3 weeks after Diem's assassination, President Kennedy himself was assassinated in Dallas. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who had been vice president and who had never been enthusiastic about the Vietnam commitment, was now president. He inherited a deteriorating situation in South Vietnam and a growing American commitment that would define and ultimately destroy his presidency. Lyndon Baines Johnson was a master of domestic politics, a legendary figure in the Senate who knew how to count votes and twist arms better than anyone in Washington. But foreign policy was not his strength, and he had serious doubts about the Vietnam commitment. During the Kennedy administration, he had privately expressed skepticism about sending American boys to fight in the jungles of Asia, but now, as president, he felt trapped by circumstances and by his own political calculations. It was 1964, an election year, and Johnson was running for president in his own right against Republican Senator Barry Goldwater, who was portraying himself as the tough anti-communist candidate. Johnson could not afford to look weak on communism. He could not afford to be the president who lost Vietnam. And so, despite his private doubts, he found himself deepening America's commitment to a war he did not fully believe in. The situation in South Vietnam continued to deteriorate throughout early 1964. The military government that had overthrown Diem proved even more incompetent than Diem had been. There was coup after coup as different generals seized power only to be overthrown by other generals. The instability in Saigon meant there was no coherent strategy for fighting the Viet Cong. The insurgents were growing stronger, controlling more territory, and inflicting heavier casualties on ARVN forces. American intelligence estimates suggested that the Viet Cong now numbered around 100,000 fighters, and North Vietnamese regular army units were beginning to infiltrate into the south in larger numbers. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was expanding into a sophisticated supply network. American advisors were reporting that South Vietnam might collapse entirely within months unless something dramatic was done. Johnson's advisors, most of whom he had inherited from Kennedy, were unanimous in recommending increased American involvement. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara argued that the United States needed to demonstrate resolve, to show both Hanoi and America's allies that the United States would not abandon its commitments. The Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to expand the war, to bomb North Vietnam and interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to take the fight to the enemy rather than waiting for them to strike in the south. But Johnson was cautious. He did not want to provoke China or the Soviet Union into direct intervention, as had happened in Korea. He wanted to keep the war limited, and he was acutely aware that the American people had not been prepared for a major war in Southeast Asia. Any significant escalation would require congressional support and public backing. What Johnson needed was a clear justification for escalation, an incident that would rally public support and give him the congressional authorization he wanted. That incident came in August 1964 in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam. What actually happened in the Gulf of Tonkin remains somewhat controversial, but the official narrative went like this. The United States had been conducting covert operations against North Vietnam, including commando raids along the coast and electronic intelligence gathering missions. On August 2, 1964, the destroyer USS Maddox was conducting an intelligence patrol in international waters in the Gulf of Tonkin when it was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The Maddox returned fire and called in air support from the nearby carrier USS Ticonderoga. One North Vietnamese boat was damaged and the others retreated. No Americans were killed and the Maddox suffered only minor damage from a single bullet. The Johnson administration initially downplayed the incident. But 2 days later, on August 4, both the Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, reported that they were under attack again. This second incident occurred at night in rough seas. The ship's radar and sonar operators reported torpedo attacks. The destroyers fired hundreds of shells at targets they believed were North Vietnamese boats. Navy pilots flew overhead but saw nothing. The destroyers reported evading numerous torpedoes. It seemed like a major attack was underway. Captain John Herrick, who commanded the patrol, sent an immediate report to his superiors. But then, after reviewing the evidence, he sent another message expressing doubts. The sonar readings might have been false echoes caused by the ship's own propellers in rough seas. The radar contacts were unclear. No one had actually seen any enemy boats. Herrick recommended a thorough investigation before concluding that an attack had occurred. In Washington, this second message was either not seen or was ignored. Johnson and his advisors decided to treat the August 4th incident as a confirmed attack on American ships in international waters. This was exactly the justification Johnson needed. He went on national television to announce that American forces had been attacked and that he had ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese naval bases and oil storage facilities. American aircraft from carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin struck targets in North Vietnam that night, the first American bombing of the North. Johnson portrayed himself as a resolute leader responding proportionally to aggression while also showing restraint. The American public rallied behind their president. His poll numbers jumped. More importantly, Johnson immediately asked Congress to pass a resolution giving him authority to take all necessary measures to protect American forces and prevent further aggression. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was drafted quickly and debated briefly. The administration portrayed it as a limited measure, not a declaration of war, but simply an expression of congressional support for the president's authority to respond to attacks and protect American interests. Most members of Congress did not want to appear unpatriotic or weak in the face of communist aggression, especially in an election year. The resolution passed the House of Representatives unanimously with a vote of 416-0. In the Senate, only 2 members voted against it: Wayne Morse of Oregon and Ernest Gruening of Alaska, both of whom warned that the resolution was a blank check that could lead to a major war. They were ignored. The final Senate vote was 88-2. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution would become one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in American history. It stated that Congress approved and supported the determination of the president to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. Johnson and subsequent administrations would use this resolution as legal justification for everything that followed: for the massive escalation of American forces, for the sustained bombing campaigns, for all the combat operations that would continue for the next decade. It was not a declaration of war, but it functioned as one, and it was based on an incident that probably never happened. Years later, declassified documents and recordings would reveal that Johnson himself had doubts about whether the August 4th attack had actually occurred. He was caught on tape saying he thought those damn stupid sailors were probably just shooting at flying fish, but he used the incident anyway because it gave him what he needed politically. In November 1964, Johnson won the presidential election in a landslide, defeating Barry Goldwater by 16 million votes. During the campaign, Johnson had portrayed himself as the peace candidate. He ran advertisements suggesting that Goldwater was a dangerous extremist who would escalate the war and risk nuclear confrontation with China. The most famous political advertisement in American history, the Daisy ad, showed a little girl counting petals on a flower before the screen dissolved into a nuclear explosion, implying that Goldwater's election would lead to nuclear war. Johnson promised voters that he would not send American boys to do the fighting that Asian boys should do. But even as he was making these campaign promises, his administration was planning for major escalation. The war was about to explode far beyond anything the American people had been led to expect. In February 1965, the Viet Cong attacked an American military installation at Pleiku in the central highlands of South Vietnam, killing 8 Americans and wounding over 100. Johnson ordered immediate retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnam. Then, days later, the Viet Cong attacked American barracks at Quy Nhon, killing 23 Americans. Johnson ordered more airstrikes. But this time, rather than stopping after the retaliatory raids, the bombing continued. Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, began in March 1965 and would continue, with occasional pauses, for the next 3 years. The stated objectives were to destroy North Vietnam's industrial capacity, to interdict the flow of men and supplies to the south, and to break the will of the North Vietnamese government by demonstrating that continued aggression would only bring more destruction. The bombing campaign was carefully calibrated. Johnson personally approved target lists, trying to avoid provoking China or the Soviet Union while still inflicting pain on North Vietnam. But the campaign did not achieve its objectives. North Vietnam had very little industry to destroy. The vast majority of its population was rural and agricultural. The Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through dense jungle and was extremely difficult to interdict from the air, and the North Vietnamese, rather than being intimidated by the bombing, were galvanized. Their determination to resist actually increased. Bombing killed thousands of North Vietnamese civilians, which Hanoi used effectively for propaganda purposes. Anti-aircraft defenses improved dramatically with Soviet and Chinese assistance. American pilots faced increasingly deadly surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery. Many aircraft were shot down and many pilots were killed or captured, and the bombing alone was not enough to stabilize South Vietnam. The ARVN continued to lose ground to the Viet Cong. In March 1965, the commander of American forces in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, sent an urgent request to Washington. He needed American combat troops, not just advisors, to prevent South Vietnamese collapse. Westmoreland wanted 2 Marine battalions to protect the key airbase at Da Nang. Johnson approved the request. On March 8, 1965, 3,500 United States Marines waited ashore at Da Nang. They were greeted by Vietnamese girls presenting them with flowers. The Marines set up defensive positions around the airbase. They were supposed to be there just to protect American installations, not to engage in offensive operations. But mission creep was inevitable. Within weeks, Westmoreland was asking for more troops and expanded authority for them to conduct offensive operations. The logic was inescapable. If American troops were in Vietnam, they needed to be able to defend themselves. If they could defend themselves, why not allow them to conduct patrols to keep the enemy at a distance? And if they were conducting patrols, why not allow them to pursue the enemy and destroy them? By summer, American troops were engaged in full combat operations, and Westmoreland kept asking for more troops. He developed a strategy called attrition. The idea was to use America's superior firepower and mobility to find the enemy, engage them in battle, and kill them faster than they could be replaced. Westmoreland believed that if enough enemy soldiers were killed, the communists would eventually reach a crossover point where they could no longer sustain their losses and would be forced to negotiate. This strategy required a lot of troops. In June, Westmoreland asked for 150,000 American soldiers. In July, Johnson approved sending 125,000, with more to follow. The escalation was happening rapidly, but Johnson tried to downplay it to the American public. He announced the troop increases at a midday press conference rather than in prime time, hoping to minimize attention. He did not call up the reserves or mobilize the National Guard, which would have required declaring a national emergency and would have made the scale of the commitment obvious. Instead, he relied on the draft to provide the necessary manpower. Young American men, many of them poor and working class, many of them minorities, were drafted and sent to Vietnam. Those with money and connections could often find ways to avoid service, getting educational deferments or finding spots in National Guard units that were unlikely to be deployed. The burden of the war fell disproportionately on those least able to avoid it. By the end of 1965, there were 184,000 American troops in Vietnam, and the number was still climbing. Americans were dying at a rate of hundreds per month. The war that Johnson had promised would be limited, that would not require American boys to do Asian boys fighting, had become a major American ground war, and it was only the beginning. The massive buildup would continue. The war would expand, the casualties would mount, and the American people would slowly, painfully come to realize that they had been misled about nearly everything concerning this war. The credibility gap between what the government said and what was actually happening in Vietnam would grow into a chasm that would tear American society apart. The American soldiers who arrived in Vietnam in 1965 and 66 came with confidence and optimism. They were the best equipped and best trained military force in the world. They had overwhelming firepower, total air superiority, helicopters that could move troops rapidly across the battlefield, and technology that the enemy could not match. Most importantly, they believed in their mission. They had been told they were fighting to defend freedom, to stop communist aggression, and to help the South Vietnamese people build a democratic nation. The average age of American combat soldiers in Vietnam was 19, significantly younger than in previous American wars. Many of them were draftees who had been pulled out of their lives and sent to fight in a war they knew little about in a country they could not find on a map before their deployment. But they were ready to do their duty. What these young Americans found when they arrived in Vietnam was unlike anything they had been trained for. This was not World War II with clear front lines and uniformed enemies. This was not even Korea with its trenches and battles for named hills. Vietnam was a war without fronts, without clear objectives, without any way to tell who was the enemy and who was a friend. The Viet Cong did not wear uniforms. They looked like any other Vietnamese farmer or villager. During the day, a village might seem peaceful and friendly. At night, that same village might be sheltering Viet Cong fighters who would ambush American patrols. Women and children could be combatants. A boy selling cold drinks might be a Viet Cong scout. An old woman working in a rice paddy might be planting booby traps. The inability to distinguish enemy from civilian created a corrosive moral ambiguity that ate away at the humanity of soldiers on all sides. General Westmoreland's strategy of attrition meant that American forces spent much of their time on search and destroy missions, going out into the countryside looking for the enemy. Companies and battalions would be helicoptered into remote areas, often landing in hot LG landing zones where they immediately came under fire. They would sweep through villages and jungle, searching for Viet Cong fighters or North Vietnamese soldiers. When they made contact with the enemy, they would call in massive firepower. Artillery would pound suspected enemy positions. Jet fighters would drop bombs and napalm. Helicopter gunships would strafe with rockets and machine guns. The American military was designed to fight with firepower, not manpower, and in Vietnam they used it lavishly. The problem was that the enemy was often mixed in with civilians, hiding in villages or using civilian areas for cover. The result was that American firepower killed enormous numbers of Vietnamese civilians. The famous phrase used to justify the destruction of the village of Ben Tre, "We had to destroy the village in order to save it," captured the terrible logic of this approach. Entire villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong would be leveled. Free fire zones were established, areas where anything that moved could be shot. Huge areas of countryside were declared hostile territory and subjected to constant bombardment. The use of defoliants, particularly Agent Orange, was another aspect of this approach. The idea was to deny the enemy cover by destroying the jungle canopy and to destroy crops that might feed Viet Cong forces. Between 1962 and 1971, the United States sprayed nearly 20 million gallons of herbicides over Vietnam, contaminating millions of acres. The long-term health effects on both Vietnamese people and American soldiers who were exposed would be devastating, causing cancers, birth defects, and other serious illnesses that continue to this day. Life for American soldiers in Vietnam was alternately terrifying and tedious. Much of their time was spent on patrols through hostile territory, carrying heavy packs in heat and humidity that many found almost unbearable. They waded through rice paddies and trudged through dense jungle where visibility was measured in feet. The threat was everywhere and nowhere. A trail might be booby-trapped with punji stakes, sharpened bamboo stakes coated with feces to cause infection. A footpath might conceal a mine. A seemingly innocent pile of leaves might hide a grenade rigged to explode when disturbed. Booby traps and mines caused a high percentage of American casualties, and there was no defense against them except constant vigilance and luck. The psychological toll of never knowing when death might strike was immense. When contact with the enemy did occur, firefights could be intense and chaotic. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army were skilled fighters who knew the terrain and used it expertly. They would ambush American units, inflict casualties, and then melt back into the jungle before the Americans could bring their superior firepower to bear. They rarely stood and fought pitched battles unless they had a significant advantage. But when major battles did occur, they could be extraordinarily violent. In the Ia Drang Valley in November 1965, the 1st Cavalry Division fought a series of battles against North Vietnamese regular army units that gave Americans their first real taste of what this war would be like. The fighting was brutal and close quarters. Helicopter pilots made repeated trips under fire to bring in reinforcements and evacuate wounded. American artillery and airstrikes killed hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers, but the Americans also took heavy casualties, with hundreds killed and wounded in just a few days of fighting. The Battle of Ia Drang was portrayed as an American victory, and in tactical terms it was. The Americans killed far more enemy soldiers than they lost. But it also revealed something troubling. The North Vietnamese had been willing to take enormous casualties and keep fighting. They had shown that they could stand toe-to-toe with American forces in conventional battles, and they had successfully withdrawn most of their forces when they decided the battle was over. The pattern established at Ia Drang would repeat throughout the war. The Americans could win battles, but they could not win the war. The enemy refused to quit. They were willing to absorb casualties that would have broken any Western army, and they retained the initiative, attacking when and where they chose, and breaking off engagements when it suited them. Back in villages and towns, American soldiers struggled to distinguish friend from foe. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam had emphasized winning hearts and minds, treating the Vietnamese people with respect and helping them with civic action projects. Some units did this well, building schools, providing medical care, and genuinely trying to improve life for villagers. But the conduct of the war made this difficult, if not impossible. How could you win hearts and minds when your artillery was destroying their villages, when their homes were being burned, when their relatives were being killed? The Viet Cong were masters of propaganda and guerrilla tactics. They would tax villagers but also provide a form of governance. They would assassinate village chiefs loyal to the Saigon government, targeting corrupt officials whom the villagers hated anyway. They would punish those who collaborated with the Americans. They convinced many Vietnamese that they represented authentic nationalism, and that the Americans were just the latest foreign invaders. Measuring progress in this war was nearly impossible. There were no front lines to advance, no territory to permanently hold. Westmoreland settled on body count as the metric of success. Units were expected to report how many enemy they had killed. These numbers were sent up the chain of command and ultimately reported to Washington as evidence that the strategy was working. But body count was a deeply flawed metric. There was enormous pressure on units to inflate their numbers. Any Vietnamese corpse might be counted as Viet Cong. Civilians killed by American firepower were often classified as enemy casualties. The numbers became almost meaningless, but they were used to demonstrate progress. McNamara and other officials would point to charts and graphs showing thousands of enemy killed and would claim that the crossover point was approaching, that the enemy could not sustain these losses much longer. But the enemy kept fighting. The disconnect between the official narrative and reality on the ground was creating frustration and cynicism among American troops. They were doing the fighting and dying, but they could see that the war was not being won. The ARVN forces they were supposed to be supporting often seemed unwilling to fight. Corruption in the South Vietnamese government was rampant. Officers sold supplies on the black market, Draft dodging was common among those with money and connections. The burden of the war fell on poor Vietnamese, just as it did on poor Americans, and there were growing questions about whether the government in Saigon was worth fighting for. After the overthrow of Diem, there had been a series of coups and military governments. In 1965, Air Marshal Nguyen Cao Khai became Prime Minister and General Nguyen Van Thu became President in what was supposed to be a more stable arrangement. But the government remained corrupt, authoritarian, and disconnected from much of the population. American soldiers also had to contend with the unique challenges of the rotation system. Unlike in previous wars where units deployed together and stayed together for the duration, in Vietnam, soldiers served individual one-year tours. This meant that units were constantly losing experienced men and gaining inexperienced replacements. Unit cohesion suffered. Short-timers, those nearing the end of their tours, were often reluctant to take risks, leading to tensions. The focus was on surviving your tours and going home, not on winning the war. And when soldiers did go home, they went individually, not with their units. They flew from the combat zone to the United States in a matter of hours, with no decompression time, no transition period. One day they were in the jungle fighting for their lives. The next day they were back in America where the war seemed distant and unreal. By 1967, the American force in Vietnam had grown to nearly 500,000 troops. They were conducting major operations sweeping through war zones C and D, fighting in the Iron Triangle and the A Shau Valley, names that would become synonymous with bitter fighting. American casualties were rising into the hundreds per week. Thousands of young Americans were coming home in body bags. The cost of the war was spiraling upward, consuming tens of billions of dollars, straining the federal budget, and forcing Johnson to choose between his domestic Great Society programs and the war. He tried to do both, but the war was winning. And despite all the blood and treasure being spent, despite all the body count and operational successes being reported, the American people were beginning to doubt that the war could be won. Television was bringing the war into American living rooms every evening. Unlike World War II with its newsreels and censorship, Vietnam was being reported in real time with graphic footage. Americans could see the violence, the destruction, the young soldiers' faces showing fear and exhaustion. The credibility gap between the official optimistic reports and what people could see on their televisions was widening into an abyss. While American soldiers fought in the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam, a different kind of battle was unfolding on the streets and campuses of America. The anti-war movement, which began as a small fringe effort in the early 1960s, was growing into a massive force that would challenge the government's conduct of the war and ultimately help change its course. The movement was diverse, including pacifists and religious groups who opposed all war on moral grounds. Leftist radicals who saw the war as imperialist aggression, civil rights activists who saw connections between racial injustice at home and the war abroad, and ordinary Americans who simply believed the war was wrong or unwinnable. As the war escalated and casualties mounted, more and more people joined their ranks. The anti-war movement found particularly fertile ground on college campuses. University students were facing the draft, and many were asking why they should risk their lives in a war whose purpose seemed unclear. The first teach-ins, organized forums where professors and students could discuss and debate the war, were held in March 1965 at the University of Michigan and quickly spread to other campuses. These events provided information about Vietnam's history and the nature of the conflict that challenged the governance narrative. Students learned that Ho Chi Minh had been a nationalist as well as a communist, that the Geneva Accords had called for elections that never happened, that the Diem government had been corrupt and repressive, and that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was far more ambiguous than they had been told. Knowledge bred skepticism, and skepticism bred opposition. The most visible early protests were organized by Students for a Democratic Society, known as SDS, in April 1965. SDS organized a march on Washington that drew 25,000 people, at the time the largest anti-war demonstration in American history. The protesters marched to the Washington Monument where they heard speakers denounce the war and call for its end. President Johnson dismissed the protesters as a misguided minority, and much of the mainstream media was critical, portraying the demonstrators as unpatriotic or naive. But the protests continued and grew larger. In October 1965, coordinated demonstrations were held in cities across the country. Tens of thousands participated. Young men began publicly burning their draft cards, an act of civil disobedience that was made a federal crime, which only increased its symbolic power. The anti-war movement was not monolithic. It included many different groups with different tactics and goals. The more moderate wing, including groups like SANE, the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, favored peaceful demonstrations and working within the political system to pressure Congress and the administration to change course. They organized teach-ins, lobbied politicians, and tried to build broad-based support for negotiations and withdrawal. The more radical wing, including groups like the Weather Underground and various Maoist and anarchist factions, saw the war as symptomatic of deeper problems with American capitalism and imperialism. Some radicals engaged in vandalism and violence, bombing ROTC buildings and draft offices. While these radical actions were carried out by a small minority, They received disproportionate media attention and gave opponents of the anti-war movement ammunition to portray all protesters as extremists. One of the most significant developments in the anti-war movement was the involvement of returning Vietnam veterans. These men had served their country, many had been wounded, all had seen combat. When they came home and spoke out against the war, it was powerful. They could not be dismissed as cowards or draft dodgers. Organizations like Vietnam Veterans Against the War gave voice to former soldiers who believed the war was immoral and unwinnable. In April 1967, Marine Corps veteran Jan Berry and others founded VVAW. These veterans would later stage dramatic demonstrations, including Operation Dewey Canyon. In April 1971, when over 1,000 veterans marched on Washington and threw their medals over a fence onto the Capitol steps. John Kerry, who would later become a senator and Secretary of State, testified before Congress asking, "How do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake?" The civil rights movement also played a crucial role in building anti-war sentiment. Martin Luther King Jr., who had initially avoided taking a strong public stance on the war for fear of alienating President Johnson and jeopardizing civil rights legislation, finally broke his silence in April 1967 with a speech at Riverside Church in New York. King called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today and drew explicit connections between the war and domestic poverty and racism. He pointed out that the money being spent in Vietnam could be used to fight poverty at home. He noted that black soldiers were dying in disproportionate numbers in Vietnam, fighting for freedoms in Southeast Asia that they did not fully enjoy in the United States. King's opposition to the war cost him support among mainstream liberals and angered Johnson, but it helped legitimize anti-war sentiment among African Americans and expanded the movement's base. Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight boxing champion, became another powerful symbol of resistance when he refused induction into the armed forces in April 1967. Ali, who had converted to Islam and changed his name from Cassius Clay, declared that he had no quarrel with the Viet Cong and that no Viet Cong ever called me nigger. He was stripped of his boxing title, banned from the sport for 3 years, and faced criminal charges. His willingness to sacrifice his career for his principles made him a hero to many in the anti-war movement and in the black community. The case eventually went to the Supreme Court, which ruled in his favor in 1971, but by then he had already paid an enormous price. The anti-war movement faced fierce opposition from supporters of the war and from the government itself. Many Americans believed that protesters were giving aid and comfort to the enemy, undermining the morale of American troops and prolonging the war. Construction workers and other blue-collar Americans, many of whom had sons serving in Vietnam, saw the protesters, particularly college students with their deferments, as privileged and unpatriotic. This class resentment would become a significant factor in American politics. In May 1970, construction workers attacked anti-war protesters in New York City in what became known as the Hard Hat Riot. The cultural divide between those who opposed the war and those who supported it, or at least believed in supporting American troops regardless of whether the war was right or wrong, created bitter divisions that would last for decades. The Johnson administration responded to the anti-war movement with a combination of public relations efforts and covert operations. The administration launched a campaign to convince the American people that the war was being won and that the protesters represented a fringe minority. Officials gave optimistic briefings claiming that enemy casualties were unsustainable and that the turning point was near. General Westmoreland was brought back to Washington in April 1967 to speak to Congress and the National Press Club, assuring Americans that progress was being made and that the end was in sight. But these assurances were increasingly contradicted by the evidence Americans could see on their television screens. More troubling were the covert operations against the anti-war movement. The FBI's COINTEL program, which had been created to monitor and disrupt communist and radical groups, was expanded to target anti-war organizations. The FBI infiltrated anti-war groups, spread disinformation, and worked to create conflicts within the movement. The CIA, despite its charter prohibiting domestic operations, ran Operation CHAOS to spy on anti-war activists and gather intelligence on connections between the movement and foreign governments. The NSA monitored international communications of anti-war leaders. These operations were illegal and would later be exposed and condemned, but at the time they were conducted in secret, part of a broader pattern of government paranoia about dissent. By October 1967, anti-war sentiment had grown to the point where massive demonstrations could be organized. On October 21st, a march on the Pentagon drew nearly 100,000 people to Washington. Protesters gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, then marched across the Potomac to the Pentagon, where they attempted to symbolically levitate the building through chanting and meditation, a theatrical gesture that captured the countercultural spirit of much of the movement. More seriously, thousands of protesters confronted military police and federal marshals guarding the Pentagon. Some protesters stuck flowers in the barrels of soldiers' rifles, creating iconic images. Others chanted and hurled insults. The confrontation lasted through the night, with hundreds of arrests. Norman Mailer chronicled the event in his book The Armies of the Night, capturing both the passion and the chaos of the movement. The anti-war movement was having an effect, though not necessarily in the way its participants intended. Polls showed that a growing percentage of Americans believed the war was a mistake. In October 1967, for the first time, a majority of Americans disapproved of Johnson's handling of the war. But this did not necessarily mean they supported the anti-war movement or favored immediate withdrawal. Many Americans were simply frustrated that the war seemed to be dragging on without resolution. They wanted victory or they wanted out, but they were losing faith that the current approach would achieve either. The anti-war movement was also contributing to social polarization. The country was splitting into hawks and doves, those who wanted to escalate and win, and those who wanted to withdraw, with the middle ground increasingly difficult to occupy. Within the Johnson administration, doubts about the war were growing even as officials publicly maintained optimism. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who had been one of the principal architects of American strategy, was privately expressing skepticism about whether the war could be won. In May 1967, he commissioned a massive study of American decision-making in Vietnam, a project that would eventually become the Pentagon Papers. By late 1967, McNamara was so disillusioned that he was arguing for de-escalation. Johnson, frustrated with McNamara's doubts, eased him out of the Pentagon and made him president of the World Bank. But McNamara's doubts reflected a broader sense within the establishment that the war was not going as planned. The credibility gap between what the administration was saying and what was actually happening was widening. Officials kept claiming that the enemy was being defeated, that pacification was succeeding, that the South Vietnamese government was growing stronger, but the war continued. The casualties mounted, and more Americans were asking fundamental questions. What were we fighting for? Why was South Vietnam worth this cost in blood and treasure? Was the domino theory really true, or was it just a rationalization? And most fundamentally, could this war be won, or was it an unwinnable quagmire? These questions were not just being asked by protesters and radicals, they were being asked by mainstream journalists, by politicians, and increasingly by ordinary Americans. The consensus that had supported the war was cracking. And then came Tet. In late 1967, General Westmoreland and other American officials were telling anyone who would listen that the war was being won. The enemy was weakening. The crossover point had been reached where American and South Vietnamese forces were killing enemy soldiers faster than they could be replaced. The pacification program was making progress in the countryside. The South Vietnamese government was stabilizing. Victory was not yet at hand, but the light at the end of the tunnel was visible. Westmoreland even returned to Washington in November to deliver this optimistic message, personally to Congress and the American people. At the National Press Club, he declared that the enemy's hopes were bankrupt and that the end was beginning to come into view. Many Americans wanted to believe this. After years of war and thousands of casualties, they desperately wanted to hear that the sacrifice had been worth it and that success was near. The reality in Vietnam was very different. In Hanoi, North Vietnamese leaders and the leadership of the National Liberation Front were planning the largest and most ambitious military operation of the war. They called it the General Offensive and General Uprising. The plan was to launch simultaneous attacks on cities and towns throughout South Vietnam during Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the most important holiday in Vietnamese culture. Traditionally, there had been informal truces during Tet. The attacks would catch the Americans and South Vietnamese by surprise. The offensive would achieve several objectives. It would demonstrate that the communists could strike anywhere in South Vietnam, exposing the weakness of the Saigon government and its American protectors. It would hopefully spark a general uprising among the South Vietnamese people against the government, and it would show the American people that the war was far from won, that all the optimistic predictions were false. The psychological impact, North Vietnamese leaders hoped, would be devastating. Preparations for the offensive took months. Weapons and supplies were moved into position, hidden in safe houses in cities and towns. Viet Cong fighters infiltrated urban areas disguised as civilians. Some weapons were smuggled in coffins, supposedly carrying bodies for burial. Others were hidden in trucks carrying flowers for Tet celebrations. The scope of the operation was enormous. Attacks were planned for more than 100 cities and towns, including all of the provincial capitals and major cities. The planning was sophisticated, and the coordination required was extraordinary. American and South Vietnamese intelligence detected increased enemy activity, but they did not anticipate the scale and nature of what was coming. They expected attacks on remote outposts, not urban centers. On January 30, 1968, the offensive began prematurely in some locations, but the main assault came in the early morning hours of January 31st, the first day of Tet. Across South Vietnam, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launched attacks. In Saigon, 19 Viet Cong commandos attacked the American embassy, blowing a hole in the wall and fighting their way into the embassy compound. It took 6 hours for American military police to kill or capture all the attackers, none of whom survived. Symbolically, the image of the American embassy under attack was devastating. If the Americans could not protect their own embassy in the capital, how could they protect anything? Television cameras captured the fighting, and Americans watching the evening news saw the war brought right to the steps of the embassy. Simultaneously, attacks were happening across the city. The presidential palace was assaulted. The radio station was seized temporarily. Tan Son Nhut Air Base came under attack. Fighting raged throughout Saigon for days. In Hue, Vietnam's ancient imperial capital, communist forces captured most of the city. They raised the Viet Cong flag over the citadel and held the city for 25 days. During their occupation of Hue, communist forces executed thousands of South Vietnamese civilians, including government officials, police officers, teachers, and Catholic priests. These were targeted killings, part of a planned purge of class enemies. The massacre in Hue was one of the worst atrocities of the war, though it received less attention in the American media than it might have otherwise because of the larger drama of the offensive. The battle to retake Hue was brutal. American Marines and ARVN forces fought house to house, street by street, through the city. The fighting destroyed much of Hue's historic architecture. Ancient temples and palaces were reduced to rubble. By the time the city was retaken in late February, thousands of civilians had been killed. The city was in ruins, and both sides had suffered heavy casualties. Similar scenes played out across South Vietnam. In most locations, the communist attacks were repulsed within hours or days, but the fighting was intense. The Viet Cong suffered enormous casualties. Tens of thousands of their fighters were killed. Many of the best and most experienced Viet Cong cadres died in the offensive. At the Marine Combat Base at Chi San near the Laotian border, a separate drama was unfolding. Beginning in January and lasting until April, North Vietnamese forces laid siege to the base, surrounding it with approximately 40,000 troops. Westmoreland had reinforced Chi San, believing that it would draw North Vietnamese forces into a set-piece battle where American firepower could destroy them. He compared it to Dien Bien Phu, but this time the Americans would be victorious. The siege became a major media event. Reporters and cameras were flown in. Americans watched as the base was pounded by artillery and mortar fire day after day. Westmoreland ordered the most intensive bombing campaign of the war in support of Chi San. Operation Niagara dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs on the surrounding area. The siege was eventually lifted in April, and Westmoreland declared victory. But in July, the Americans abandoned Chi San, dismantling the base and withdrawing. The entire siege seemed pointless in retrospect, as if it had been fought simply because both sides had decided it was important, not for any strategic reason. From a purely military standpoint, the Tet Offensive was a defeat for the communists. They failed to hold any of the cities they attacked. The general uprising they hoped for never materialized. The South Vietnamese people did not rise up to support them. The Viet Cong suffered catastrophic casualties that effectively destroyed them as a fighting force. From this point on, the war would be carried primarily by North Vietnamese regular army units rather than Southern guerrillas. The American military could legitimately claim that they had inflicted a major defeat on the enemy. Westmoreland called it a desperate go-for-broke effort by a failing enemy. But in the larger sense, in the political and psychological dimensions that matter most in wars of this nature, Tet was a devastating defeat for the United States. The American people had been told that the enemy was weak and defeated, that victory was near. Now they could see on their television screens that the enemy was capable of attacking everywhere simultaneously, even the American embassy in Saigon. The disconnect between the optimistic predictions and the reality on the ground was impossible to ignore. The credibility gap became a credibility chasm. If the military and the administration had been wrong about this, what else had they been wrong about? The most trusted man in America, CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, traveled to Vietnam after Tet and returned to deliver an editorial on the evening news. Cronkite said that it was increasingly clear that the only rational way out would be to negotiate, not as victors but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. When Johnson watched Cronkite's editorial, he reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Public opinion turned decisively against the war after Tet. Support for Johnson's handling of the war dropped to an all-time low. The anti-war movement gained new momentum and new supporters. Crucially, establishment figures were now questioning the war. Within the Democratic Party, Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota had already announced he would challenge Johnson for the presidential nomination on an anti-war platform. In the New Hampshire primary in March, McCarthy received 42% of the vote to Johnson's 49%, a strong showing that demonstrated the president's vulnerability. 4 days later, Senator Robert Kennedy, brother of the slain president, entered the race, also opposing the war. The prospect of a bitter intra-party fight loomed. Behind closed doors, Johnson was receiving even more disturbing news. After Tet, Westmoreland requested 200,000 additional troops to take advantage of the enemy's weakened state and finish the job. The request forced a complete policy review. Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford, who had replaced McNamara, convened a group of senior officials to study the request. What they found was alarming. There was no plan for victory. There was no end in sight. The military could not guarantee that 200,000 more troops would make a decisive difference. The costs would be enormous, requiring mobilization of reserves, major tax increases, and further neglect of domestic problems. Clifford concluded that the current course was leading nowhere and recommended against the troop increase. The Wise Men, a group of senior statesmen and former officials whom Johnson respected and consulted regularly, were asked to review the situation. Most of them concluded that the war could not be won and that the United States needed to find a way out. On March 31, 1968, Lyndon Johnson addressed the nation on television. He announced a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam and called on Hanoi to begin negotiations. Then, in a stunning conclusion, he announced that he would not seek nor would he accept his party's nomination for another term as president. Johnson, one of the most skilled and ambitious politicians in American history, was giving up power. The war had destroyed his presidency. He had come to office with dreams of creating a great society, of eliminating poverty and racism, of building a better America. Instead, the war had consumed his presidency, divided the country, and left him a broken and defeated man. The announcement shocked the nation. The war had claimed another casualty, the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. Hanoi agreed to negotiations and talks began in Paris in May. But the negotiations would drag on for years, complicated by disputes over procedures, demands and counter-demands, and continued fighting on the ground. The war would not end quickly or icily, but after Tet, the fundamental question had changed. It was no longer whether America would win the war. It was how America would extricate itself from the war without completely abandoning South Vietnam and without appearing to have lost. The war would continue for 7 more years, with tens of thousands more Americans and hundreds of thousands more Vietnamese dying. But Tet was the turning point, the moment when the illusions were shattered and the American people turned against the war decisively. The confidence and optimism with which America had entered the war had been replaced by doubt, division, and a desperate desire to find a way out of the nightmare that Vietnam had become. The year 1968 would become one of the most tumultuous in American history, a year when it seemed the nation was coming apart at the seams. The war in Vietnam was the underlying cause of much of the chaos, but the violence and division extended far beyond debates about foreign policy. America was experiencing multiple crises simultaneously, each feeding into and amplifying the others. The social fabric was tearing, and many Americans wondered if their country could survive intact. The optimism and confidence that had characterized the early 1960s had given way to anger, fear, and a profound sense that something fundamental had gone wrong with the American experiment. Just 4 days after President Johnson announced he would not seek re-election, on April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. King had gone to Memphis to support striking sanitation workers. Continuing his work of linking the struggle for civil rights with economic justice, he was standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel when James O. Ray shot him. King died within an hour. The news of his assassination sparked riots in more than 100 cities across America. In Washington, D.C., buildings burned within blocks of the White House. Federal troops and National Guard units were deployed to restore order. In Chicago, Baltimore, Kansas City, and dozens of other cities, similar scenes played out. Entire neighborhoods went up in flames. Stores were looted. Police and National Guard troops confronted angry crowds. By the time the riot subsided, 46 people were dead, thousands were injured, and tens of thousands had been arrested. The assassination of the apostle of nonviolence seemed to many to mark the death of the hope that America's racial problems could be solved peacefully. The Democratic Party was in chaos. With Johnson out of the race, Vice President Hubert Humphrey entered as the establishment candidate, supporting the administration's Vietnam policy. Senator Eugene McCarthy and Senator Robert Kennedy competed for the anti-war vote. Kennedy was emerging as the frontrunner, winning primaries and drawing enormous crowds. On June 5, after winning the crucial California primary, Kennedy was speaking to supporters at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. As he left through the hotel kitchen, a young Palestinian immigrant named Sirhan shot him. Kennedy died 26 hours later. The assassination devastated the anti-war movement and the millions of Americans who had seen Kennedy as a figure who could heal the nation's divisions. It seemed impossible that another Kennedy had been murdered. The sense that America was spiraling into violence and chaos deepened. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August became a symbol of everything that was wrong with America in 1968. Inside the convention hall, there was bitter division over the Vietnam War. The party establishment supported Humphrey in a platform plank that essentially endorsed continued prosecution of the war. Anti-war delegates fought for a plank calling for immediate withdrawal, but they were defeated. Outside the convention, thousands of anti-war protesters had gathered. Chicago's Mayor Richard Daley was determined there would be no disruption. He deployed thousands of police officers and called in the National Guard. For several days, protesters and police confronted each other in Chicago's parks and streets. The protesters chanted and demonstrated. The police responded with clubs and tear gas. On the night of August 28, as the convention was nominating Humphrey, a police riot erupted in front of the Conrad Hilton Hotel. Police beat protesters, journalists, and innocent bystanders indiscriminately. The violence was broadcast on live television. Protesters chanted the whole world is watching, and they were right. The images of police brutality shocked many Americans and confirmed for others that the anti-war movement was a dangerous force threatening law and order. The chaos of the Democratic Convention helped Republican candidate Richard Nixon, who had positioned himself as the law and order candidate. Nixon promised to restore order to American streets and to end the war in Vietnam, though he was deliberately vague about how he would do so. He claimed to have a secret plan to end the war with honor, but he never revealed what it was. Nixon appealed to what he called the silent majority, the Americans who were neither radical protesters nor establishment elites, who were tired of the chaos and wanted stability. Nixon also benefited from the third-party candidacy of George Wallace, the segregationist former governor of Alabama, who drew votes from working-class Democrats, particularly in the South, who were angry about civil rights and anti-war protests. In November, Nixon won a narrow victory over Humphrey, receiving 43% of the popular vote to Humphrey's 42%, with Wallace getting 13%. The Electoral College margin was wider, but Nixon had no mandate. He was inheriting a nation bitterly divided, and a war that had destroyed his predecessor. Nixon had promised to end the war, but his strategy was not withdrawal. It was what he called Vietnamization, turning over the fighting to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing American troops. The idea was that with continued American air support, equipment, and training, the ARVN could hold its own against the communists. This would allow Nixon to reduce American casualties and troop levels, easing domestic opposition, while still maintaining an independent non-communist South Vietnam. In theory, Vietnamization could work. In practice, it faced enormous obstacles. The ARVN suffered from all the problems it had always had: poor leadership, corruption, low morale, and political interference. Could these problems be overcome? Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger were willing to try, but they were also realists. They knew that South Vietnam might not survive on its own. Their goal was to create a decent interval between American withdrawal and the probable collapse of South Vietnam, so that the collapse would not appear to be America's fault. Kissinger began secret negotiations with North Vietnamese representatives in Paris, separate from the official peace talks. He met with Le Duc, though, a senior North Vietnamese Politburo member. The negotiations were difficult and often frustrating. The North Vietnamese demanded complete American withdrawal and the removal of the Thu government in Saigon. The Americans insisted that North Vietnamese forces also had to withdraw from the South and that the Thu government had to be preserved. Neither side was willing to compromise on these fundamental points. The secret talks produced no breakthroughs, but they continued, year after year, while the war ground on. Meanwhile, Nixon escalated the war in ways that were kept secret from the American people. In March 1969, he authorized Operation Menu, a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnamese sanctuaries in Cambodia. Cambodia was officially neutral, but the North Vietnamese were using eastern Cambodia as a base area and supply route. Nixon ordered B-52 strikes against these areas but insisted the bombing be kept secret. False reports were filed to hide the true targets. Congress and the American people were not informed. The anti-war movement, which had hoped Nixon's election might lead to rapid escalation, was outraged when it became clear that the war was continuing. In October 1969, massive demonstrations were organized. The moratorium to end the war in Vietnam on October 15 brought millions of people into the streets in cities and towns across America. It was the largest anti-war demonstration in American history up to that point. A month later, on November 15, over 500,000 people marched in Washington, D.C. in the largest single anti-war protest ever held in the Capitol. Nixon publicly claimed to ignore the protests, saying that policy could not be made in the streets, but privately he was deeply concerned about public opinion. He had his aides organize counter-demonstrations and work to mobilize the silent majority in support of his policies. The war was also radicalizing some elements of the anti-war movement. The Weather Underground, a splinter group from SDS, embraced violence as a tactic. They bombed government buildings, though they generally tried to avoid causing casualties. The Weathermen saw themselves as revolutionaries fighting American imperialism. Their actions were condemned by most anti-war activists, but they received significant media attention, which further polarized public opinion. To many Americans, the anti-war movement seemed to be descending into violence and chaos, which strengthened support for Nixon's law and order rhetoric. The administration used the actions of a small violent fringe to delegitimize the entire anti-war movement, portraying all protesters as dangerous radicals. Within the military, morale was deteriorating badly. Soldiers in Vietnam could see that America was withdrawing, that the policy was Vietnamization, that South Vietnam was being turned over to the ARVN. The logical conclusion was that the United States did not believe South Vietnam could be saved, so why should young Americans continue to die for it? Soldiers began asking the terrible question, who wants to be the last man to die for a mistake? Drug use increased dramatically. Heroin was readily available in Vietnam, and many soldiers used it to cope with the stress and meaninglessness of the war. Racial tensions that reflected broader social conflicts in America erupted into violence between white and black soldiers. Most disturbing was the phenomenon of fragging, the murder of unpopular officers by their own troops. The term came from the use of fragmentation grenades, which left no fingerprints and could be rolled into an officer's tent at night. Hundreds of fragging incidents were reported, and the actual number was likely much higher. The army was breaking down from within. The revelation of atrocities committed by American troops further damaged support for the war. In March 1968, American soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment had entered the village of My Lai in Quang Ngai Province. Over the course of several hours, they systematically murdered hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly men. They raped women, killed livestock, and burned the village. The soldiers had been told that My Lai was a Viet Cong stronghold, but they encountered no enemy fire and found no weapons. They simply massacred civilians. The immediate military reporting covered up the massacre, but in November 1969, journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story. Photographs taken by Army photographer Ron Hepburn, showing piles of bodies and terrified villagers moments before they were killed, were published and horrified the world. The My Lai massacre became a symbol of what the war had done to American morality. How could American soldiers, raised in a democratic society with strong moral values, commit such atrocities? The answer was complex. The soldiers had been operating in an environment where distinguishing enemy from civilian was nearly impossible. They had suffered casualties from mines and booby traps. Some of their friends had been killed. They were angry and afraid. Their commander, Lieutenant William Calley, was either incompetent or malicious or both. And the dehumanization of the Vietnamese people, referring to them as gooks and treating them as less than human, made it psychologically easier to kill them. Calley was eventually court-martialed and convicted of murdering 22 civilians. Though the number was certainly much higher, he served 3.5 years under house arrest before being released. The light sentence outraged many, as did the fact that high-ranking officers who bore responsibility for creating the conditions that led to My Lai were never seriously punished. My Lai was not an isolated incident, though it was one of the worst. Atrocities by both sides occurred throughout the war. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese committed widespread atrocities, including the massacre at Hue during Tet and countless assassinations and terror attacks against civilians. But America held itself to a higher standard, or at least it claimed to. The revelation that American soldiers had committed such acts shattered many people's belief in the righteousness of the American cause. If this was what America was doing in Vietnam, many asked, then what were we fighting for? The moral authority that America claimed in its struggle against communism seemed hollow when American soldiers were murdering unarmed civilians. The war was not just failing militarily and politically, it was failing morally, and that failure would haunt America for generations. Richard Nixon had promised peace with honor, but by 1970, the war was expanding rather than contracting. The secret bombing of Cambodia that had begun in March 1969 was not enough for Nixon and Kissinger. They believed that North Vietnamese sanctuaries in Cambodia were enabling the continued war in South Vietnam. If those sanctuaries could be eliminated, it might give Vietnamization the time it needed to succeed. In Cambodia itself, political upheaval provided an opportunity. Prince Norodom Sihanouk, who had tried to keep Cambodia neutral, was overthrown in March 1970 by General Lon Nol in a coup that was likely encouraged if not directly supported by the United States. The new government was pro-American and anti-communist, and it asked for American assistance against North Vietnamese forces in Cambodia. On April 30, 1970, Nixon announced that American and South Vietnamese forces were launching an incursion into Cambodia to destroy North Vietnamese bases and supplies. He portrayed this as a temporary operation to protect American troops and aid Vietnamization. But to most Americans, it looked like the war was expanding into another country. Nixon had promised to end the war, but now he was invading Cambodia. The announcement sparked immediate outrage. College campuses exploded in protest. At many universities, students went on strike, refusing to attend classes. Some administration buildings were occupied, ROTC buildings were burned. The nation seemed on the brink of a generational civil war between young people who opposed the war and older Americans who supported it, or at least supported the president's authority to conduct it. The most tragic confrontation occurred at Kent State University in Ohio. On May 1st, protests broke out on campus. That night, downtown Kent experienced riots, with windows broken and some small fires started. Mayor Leroy Satram declared a state of emergency and requested assistance from the National Guard. On May 2nd, the ROTC building on campus was burned down. It was never definitively determined who started the fire, but authorities blamed student radicals. Governor James Rhodes sent in the National Guard and gave an inflammatory speech calling the protesters the worst type of people we harbor in America and comparing them to brown shirts and vigilantes. On May 3rd, Sunday Guardsmen used tear gas to disperse protesters. Tensions were high. The Guardsmen, many of them young men themselves, were tired and nervous. On May 4th, despite a ban on rallies, about 2,000 students gathered on the campus commons for a protest. National Guard troops ordered them to disperse. When the students refused, the Guard advanced, firing tear gas. Students threw rocks and tear gas canisters back at the Guardsmen. The Guard retreated up a hill. What happened next remained somewhat unclear and controversial. As the Guardsmen reached the top of the hill, some of them turned and fired their rifles into the crowd of students. They fired for 13 seconds, 67 shots. 4 students were killed. Jeffrey Miller, Alison Krauss, William Schroeder, and Sandra Schua were shot dead. 9 others were wounded, one of whom was paralyzed for life. Some of those killed had been participating in the protest. Others, like Schua, were simply walking to class. The distance between the guardsmen and the students they shot ranged from 60 feet to nearly 750 feet. There was no order to fire. Individual guardsmen made the decision to shoot. The photograph of Marianne Vecchio, a 14-year-old runaway, kneeling over Jeffrey Miller's body and screaming, became one of the iconic images of the Vietnam era. The killings at Kent State shocked the nation. 4 students had been killed by American soldiers on an American campus. President Nixon's initial response was callous. He said that when dissent turns to violence, it invites tragedy. Many people blamed the students themselves, saying that if they had not been protesting, they would not have been shot. But many others were horrified that the government's response to protest was to shoot young people. Over 4 million students participated in a national strike. Over 400 universities and colleges were shut down or disrupted. Nixon claimed he was not affected, but he was. Late one night, unable to sleep, he went to the Lincoln Memorial at 4:30 in the morning and talked with student protesters who had gathered there, a bizarre and poignant encounter that revealed how isolated and desperate Nixon felt. 10 days after Kent State, another tragedy occurred that received far less attention but was equally revealing of the nation's divisions. At Jackson State College, a historically black university in Mississippi, students were protesting the war and racial injustice. On May 15, police fired into a crowd of students, killing 2 and wounding 12. The killings at Jackson State received a fraction of the media coverage that Kent State had received, a disparity that highlighted the continued racism in American society. The message seemed clear: when white students at a white university were killed, it was a national tragedy. When black students at a black university were killed, it was barely news. The differential treatment contributed to the anger and alienation felt by many African Americans. The Cambodian incursion achieved limited tactical success. American and ARVN forces captured some supplies and disrupted some North Vietnamese operations, but they did not find the mythical COSVN, the Central Office for South Vietnam that American intelligence believed was the headquarters coordinating communist operations. The enemy simply moved deeper into Cambodia or back into Vietnam. The operation may have bought some time for Vietnamization, but at enormous political cost. Congress was outraged that Nixon had expanded the war without consulting them. In June, the Senate repealed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. It was a symbolic gesture since Nixon claimed he did not need congressional authorization to conduct the war, but it demonstrated how completely congressional support for the war had evaporated. Congress also passed the Cooper Church Amendment, which prohibited American ground troops from operating in Cambodia after July 1st. It was the first time in the war that Congress had successfully restricted the president's ability to conduct military operations. The expansion into Cambodia destabilized that country and contributed to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, a communist guerrilla movement that would eventually take power and commit genocide. The American bombing and the civil war that followed destroyed Cambodia's agricultural economy and social fabric. The Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, would capture the capital Phnom Penh in 1975 and implement one of the most brutal regimes of the 20th century, killing perhaps 2 million Cambodians, a quarter of the country's population, through executions, forced labor, and starvation. While the Khmer Rouge bore responsibility for their atrocities, American actions in Cambodia had helped create the conditions that allowed them to come to power. The Vietnam War's destructive effects were not limited to Vietnam. In 1971, another secret began to emerge that would further undermine public trust in the government. Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst who had worked on the Pentagon Papers, the classified study of American decision-making in Vietnam, commissioned by Robert McNamara, decided that the American people needed to know the truth about how the United States had gotten into the war. Ellsberg had been a supporter of the war, but his experience in Vietnam and his work on the Pentagon Papers had turned him into an opponent. He believed that the documents showed a pattern of deliberate deception by multiple administrations. Presidents and their advisors had consistently lied to the American people about the war's progress, about American intentions, and about their own doubts. Ellsberg photocopied the 7,000-page study and gave it to the New York Times. On June 13, 1971, the Times began publishing excerpts from the Pentagon Papers. The revelations were explosive. The documents showed that the Johnson administration had planned to escalate the war, even while promising the American people during the 1964 campaign that it would not base. They showed that American officials had doubts about the war's winnability much earlier than they publicly admitted. They revealed the full extent of covert operations and secret bombings. They demonstrated a pattern of deception that spanned multiple administrations, both Democratic and Republican. The Pentagon Papers covered events only through 1968, so they did not implicate the Nixon administration directly, but Nixon was furious. He saw the leak as a dangerous precedent and a threat to his own secret diplomacy and covert operations. Nixon's administration obtained a court order stopping the Times from publishing more of the Pentagon Papers, claiming that publication threatened national security. The Washington Post then began publishing them, and it too was enjoined. The case quickly reached the Supreme Court, which ruled in New York Times Co. v. United States that the government had not met the heavy burden of proof required to justify prior restraint of the press. The newspapers could continue publishing. It was a victory for press freedom, but the battle over the Pentagon Papers had significant consequences. Nixon, already paranoid about leaks and enemies, became convinced that he needed to take extraordinary measures to protect secrets and punish those who revealed them. Nixon established a secret unit within the White House called the Plumbers, whose job was to stop leaks. The Plumbers broke into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, looking for damaging information about him. They engaged in various illegal activities and dirty tricks. This unit would eventually evolve into the broader campaign of illegal activities that would become the Watergate scandal. Nixon's obsession with his enemies and his willingness to use illegal means to fight them would ultimately destroy his presidency. In this sense, Vietnam not only divided the nation and damaged America's international standing, it also corrupted the presidency itself. The war created an atmosphere of secrecy, paranoia, and contempt for legal and constitutional norms that led directly to Watergate. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, Vietnamization was being tested. In February 1971, ARVN forces launched an operation into Laos called Lam Son 719, aimed at cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. American ground troops were prohibited from entering Laos by the Cooper Church Amendment, so the operation was conducted by ARVN forces with American air support. The operation was a disaster. North Vietnamese forces were waiting for them. The ARVN units suffered heavy casualties and eventually retreated in chaos. Images of ARVN soldiers clinging desperately to helicopter skids to escape were broadcast around the world. The operation raised serious doubts about whether Vietnamization could succeed. If the ARVN could not conduct successful offensive operations with full American air support, how would they survive when American support was withdrawn? Nixon continued to withdraw American troops, but the pace was calibrated to political needs at home rather than military realities in Vietnam. By the end of 1971, American troop levels had fallen to about 150,000 from their peak of over 500,000. American casualties were declining as fewer Americans were in combat, but the war continued. The air war was intensifying. American aircraft were bombing North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia with increasing tonnage. The United States would drop more bombs on Indochina during the Vietnam War than were dropped by all sides during World War II. The destruction was immense, and the civilian casualties were in the hundreds of thousands. But the bombing did not break North Vietnam's will to fight, and it did not stop the flow of supplies to the south. The futility of the air war was symbolized by the tiger cages of Con Son Island, where the South Vietnamese government imprisoned political prisoners in brutal conditions, and by the continued use of napalm and Agent Orange, which were causing horrific suffering and long-term environmental damage. American pilots were shot down and imprisoned in North Vietnam, where they were tortured and held in terrible conditions, some for many years. The POW issue would become a major factor in American politics and in the eventual negotiations to end the war. But as 1971 ended and 1972 began, there was still no end in sight. The war ground on more people died. The peace talks in Paris remained deadlocked, and America remained trapped in a war it could neither win nor abandon. A war that was tearing the nation apart and destroying its faith in its own government and institutions. As 1972 began, Richard Nixon was preparing for his re-election campaign. He needed to show progress in ending the war, but he also could not afford to appear weak or to abandon South Vietnam in a way that would be seen as an American defeat. The contradictions inherent in his position were difficult to resolve. Nixon and Kissinger had been conducting secret negotiations with North Vietnam for 3 years, with little to show for it. Both sides remained far apart on fundamental issues. The North Vietnamese insisted on the removal of South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thu as part of any settlement. The Americans refused. The North Vietnamese demanded the right to keep their troops in South Vietnam after a ceasefire. The Americans wanted them withdrawn. And underlying everything was the question of South Vietnam's future. Would it remain an independent, non-communist nation, or would it eventually be reunified under communist control? In March 1972, North Vietnam launched a massive conventional invasion of South Vietnam. The Easter Offensive involved over 100,000 North Vietnamese troops attacking across the demilitarized zone and from sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos. This was not guerrilla warfare. This was a conventional military invasion with tanks, artillery, and coordinated combined arms operations. The ARVN forces reeled under the assault. Several provinces fell. The city of Quang Tri was captured. It appeared that South Vietnam might collapse, but American air power came to the rescue. Nixon ordered massive bombing campaigns, including the resumption of bombing North Vietnam above the 20th parallel for the first time since 1968. Operation Linebacker saw American aircraft, including B-52 strategic bombers, pound North Vietnamese forces in the south and targets in North Vietnam itself. The bombing was devastating. Combined with ARVN forces fighting desperately to hold key positions, the offensive was eventually stopped. By summer, the ARVN had even counterattacked and retaken Quang Tri. The Easter offensive had failed, but the offensive had demonstrated several important things. First, the ARVN could fight effectively when it had American air support and when its survival was at stake. Second, without American air support, the ARVN would likely have been defeated. And third, North Vietnam remained committed to reunifying the country by force and was willing to take enormous casualties to achieve it. The Easter Offensive cost the North Vietnamese perhaps 100,000 casualties, but it had tested Vietnamization and found its limits. This reality was not lost on anyone, least of all on the negotiators in Paris. Both sides now had incentives to reach an agreement. North Vietnam knew it could not conquer the South as long as American air power was available. But it also knew that American domestic politics would eventually force a complete American withdrawal. Nixon knew he needed an agreement before the election to demonstrate that his policy had succeeded. And he knew that American air support could not continue indefinitely once American ground troops were gone and American prisoners were not yet home. In October 1972, after intense secret negotiations, Kissinger and Le Duc though reached a breakthrough. The key compromise was that North Vietnam dropped its demand for Thieus removal as a precondition for an agreement. The United States tacitly accepted that North Vietnamese troops could remain in South Vietnam after a ceasefire. Both sides were essentially agreeing to disagree about the ultimate political fate of South Vietnam, postponing that resolution to some future time. The agreement called for a ceasefire in place, meaning both sides would hold the territory they currently controlled. American troops would withdraw within 60 days. American prisoners of war would be released. An international commission would supervise the agreement. And critically, there would be negotiations between the South Vietnamese government and the Provisional Revolutionary Government, the political arm of the Viet Cong, to determine South Vietnam's political future. The vagueness about this political process was deliberate. Each side could interpret it as they wished. On October 26, 1972, just days before the presidential election, Kissinger announced that peace is at hand. It was a premature announcement calculated to help Nixon's re-election prospects. Nixon won in a landslide, defeating Democratic nominee George McGovern, who had run on an anti-war platform, by over 20 million votes. The American people, it seemed, wanted Nixon to finish the job of ending the war, but peace was not yet at hand. South Vietnamese President Tho was furious about the proposed agreement. He had not been consulted about key provisions. He believed that allowing North Vietnamese troops to remain in the South was a death sentence for his government. He refused to sign. Nixon had to choose between pressuring Tho to accept the agreement or continuing the war. He tried to have it both ways. In December 1972, the Paris negotiations broke down over disputes about implementation details and South Vietnamese objections. Nixon decided to show both Hanoi and Saigon who was in control. On December 18, he ordered Operation Linebacker to a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam. For 11 days, American B-52 bombers struck targets in Hanoi and Haiphong in what became known as the Christmas bombing. It was the most intensive bombing campaign of the war. Thousands of tons of bombs were dropped. The North Vietnamese fired hundreds of surface-to-air missiles, shooting down 15 B-52s and 11 other aircraft. Hundreds of civilians were killed, including many in a mistaken strike on a hospital. The bombing was condemned around the world. Even traditional American allies were critical. But Nixon was sending a message. He was willing to use overwhelming force if necessary, and both Hanoi and Saigon needed to understand that. The bombing achieved its purpose, at least in Nixon's terms. It brought the North Vietnamese back to the negotiating table, willing to finalize the agreement. More importantly, it allowed Nixon to make credible threats to Tho. Nixon sent Tho a letter essentially ordering him to sign the agreement. Nixon promised continued American aid and, more critically, promised that if North Vietnam violated the ceasefire, the United States would respond with full force. Nixon's letter said that if South Vietnam refused to sign, the United States would negotiate an agreement without them and cut off all aid. Faced with this ultimatum and with promises of continued American support if he agreed, Tho reluctantly gave way. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement was almost identical to what had been negotiated in October. The bombing and delays had achieved very little except more death and destruction. The Paris Peace Accords officially ended direct American military involvement in Vietnam. American troops would withdraw within 60 days. American prisoners of war would be released. A ceasefire was to take effect, though both sides violated it almost immediately, each trying to grab as much territory as possible before it became permanent. The agreement did not end the war. It ended American participation in the war. For American politicians and much of the American public, that was enough. The troops came home. Operation Homecoming in February and March 1973 brought back nearly 600 American POWs, many of whom had been held for years in terrible conditions. Their return was emotional and widely celebrated. For most Americans, the war was over. They wanted to forget about Vietnam and move on, but for the Vietnamese, North and South, the war continued. The ceasefire existed only on paper. Fighting continued across South Vietnam as both sides jockeyed for position. The North Vietnamese used the ceasefire to rebuild their forces and infiltrate more troops and supplies into the south. The Ho Chi Minh Trail became a highway with actual paved roads. Soviet and Chinese aid poured into North Vietnam. The ARVN also prepared for the inevitable showdown, but they faced growing problems. American aid was being reduced as Congress cut funding for Vietnam. The ARVN was dependent on American equipment and supplies, and without the flow of replacements in fuel and ammunition, their effectiveness declined. Corruption remained rampant. Morale was deteriorating, and most critically, American air power, which had been essential in stopping the Easter Offensive, was gone. The agreement prohibited American military action in Vietnam, even if Nixon had wanted to resume bombing, which he did when North Vietnam violated the ceasefire. He could not. The political climate in America would not support it, and Congress would not allow it. Nixon's ability to support South Vietnam was further undermined by the Watergate scandal, which was now consuming his presidency. The break-in at Democratic National Committee headquarters in June 1972 had seemed like a minor story at the time. But investigative reporting by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of The Washington Post had uncovered connections to the White House. Senate hearings in 1973 revealed a pattern of illegal activities and abuse of power. Most devastatingly, it was revealed that Nixon had recorded all conversations in the Oval Office, and these tapes might provide evidence of criminal activity. As the scandal deepened, Nixon's authority and credibility evaporated. He could not make credible threats to North Vietnam because everyone knew he was fighting for his political survival. Congress was reasserting its authority over foreign policy and was determined to prevent any resumption of American involvement in Vietnam. In November 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution over Nixon's veto. The resolution required the president to consult with Congress before committing troops to combat, and limited how long troops could remain in combat without congressional authorization. It was a direct response to the Vietnam War and the imperial presidency that had conducted it. Congress also cut funding for military operations in Southeast Asia, first prohibiting any American combat operations in Laos and Cambodia after August 1973, and then reducing aid to South Vietnam. The message was clear. America was done with Vietnam. Congress and the American people wanted no more involvement, no more aid, no more war. South Vietnam was on its own. In Saigon, President Thieu watched these developments with growing alarm. The promises Nixon had made to him, that America would respond forcefully to North Vietnamese violations, were revealed as hollow. America was not going to intervene again. The aid that South Vietnam depended on was being cut. The political will in America to support South Vietnam had evaporated. Thieu tried to rally his forces and prepare for the coming onslaught, but the situation was deteriorating. His government remained corrupt and unpopular. The economy was struggling as American dollars dried up. Desertions from the ARVN were increasing. In the countryside, the Viet Cong were slowly rebuilding their strength, and in the north, the People's Army of Vietnam was preparing for a final offensive to reunify the country by force. The Paris Peace Accords had not brought peace. They had brought a temporary pause, a decent interval that allowed America to extricate itself from the war with some semblance of dignity. Whether South Vietnam could survive on its own remained an open question, though most observers were pessimistic. Kissinger and La Duc, though, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating the Paris Accords, though La Duc, declined to accept it, saying there was no peace in Vietnam. He was right. The final act of the tragedy was yet to come. For America, the war was over, or so Americans desperately wanted to believe. For Vietnam, the war would continue until one side achieved total victory. And that would not be the side America had supported. The hopes and sacrifices, the billions of dollars and 58,000 American lives, the hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese lives, all of it would prove insufficient to achieve the goal of preserving an independent non-communist South Vietnam. The question that haunted America was whether it had ever been possible, and whether the cost had been worth paying for an objective that was probably unattainable from the start. The year 1974 was a time of desperate hope in South Vietnam. President Thieu and his government clung to the belief that somehow they could survive, that American aid would continue, that the ARVN could hold against the North Vietnamese, or that international pressure would restrain Hanoi from launching an all-out offensive. But these hopes were increasingly detached from reality. In the United States, the Watergate scandal was reaching its climax. Nixon resigned in disgrace in August 1974, replaced by Gerald Ford, who had no mandate and little political capital. Congress was dominated by Democrats, many of them elected in the Watergate aftermath, and they were determined to end American involvement in Southeast Asia once and for all. When Ford requested additional aid for South Vietnam, Congress refused. American aid to South Vietnam dropped from over $2 billion in 1973 to $700 million in 1974. The ARVN, which had been built to depend on massive American logistical support, found itself unable to operate effectively with reduced supplies of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Meanwhile, North Vietnam was rebuilding its forces with substantial Soviet and Chinese aid. The Ho Chi Minh Trail had been expanded into a modern logistics network with paved roads, fuel pipelines, and communication lines. Thousands of troops were infiltrating into the south. Tanks and artillery were being positioned for the coming offensive. The North Vietnamese leadership debated the timing and scale of their final push. Conservative voices argued for a cautious approach, continuing to build up forces and waiting for the opportune moment. But others, particularly General Van Tien Dung, argued that conditions would never be better. American intervention was impossible. The ARVN was weakening, South Vietnamese morale was declining. The time to strike was now. In December 1974, North Vietnam launched a test offensive in Phuoc Long Province, capturing the provincial capital. It was a clear violation of the Paris Accords, but America did nothing. No bombers appeared, no military response came. The message was clear to Hanoi: America would not intervene. The way was open for a full-scale invasion. In March 1975, North Vietnam launched the final offensive. It began in the Central Highlands, targeting the town of Ban My Thuot. The attack was swift and successful. ARVN forces in the area collapsed. President Thu, without consulting his military commanders or allies, made a fateful decision. He ordered a retreat from the Central Highlands to consolidate forces and defend more critical areas. The retreat was supposed to be an orderly withdrawal along Route 7, but it turned into a catastrophe. As ARVN units pulled back, panic spread. Soldiers abandoned their positions. Civilians, terrified of communist revenge, fled with the military. The withdrawal became a chaotic rout. Thousands of refugees streamed down Route 7 in what became known as the Convoy of Tears. They were harassed by communist forces and decimated by lack of supplies and organization. Most never reached safety. Entire ARVN divisions disintegrated. Equipment worth millions of dollars was abandoned. The collapse in the Central Highlands triggered a domino effect across South Vietnam. In the northern provinces, ARVN forces also began to retreat, and these retreats also turned into panicked routs. The cities of Hue and Da Nang, which had been held throughout the war, fell in late March. In Da Nang, the scenes were apocalyptic. Hundreds of thousands of refugees converged on the city trying to escape. The airport was overrun by mobs. Ships meant to evacuate military personnel were stormed by desperate civilians. Some ships left so overloaded that people were literally hanging from the sides. Thousands drowned when overloaded boats capsized. The panic and chaos exceeded anything seen in modern warfare. The ARVN units in the north simply ceased to exist as organized fighting forces. The collapse was so rapid and complete that it shocked even the North Vietnamese, who had expected the campaign to take months or even years. With the northern provinces lost and the Central Highlands gone, the North Vietnamese turned south toward Saigon. They faced minimal resistance. ARVN units that had not already disintegrated surrendered or fled. In Saigon, there was still denial. Some officials believed that a negotiated settlement could be reached, that the North Vietnamese would stop short of total conquest. President Thu finally agreed to resign on April 21st, hoping that his departure might enable negotiations. In a bitter farewell address, he accused the United States of betrayal, of making promises it did not keep. He left for Taiwan, eventually settling in exile in London, taking with him tons of gold from the national treasury. He was replaced by Vice President Tran Van Hoang, who lasted a week before transferring power to General Duong Van Minh, the same general who had led the coup against Diem 12 years earlier. Minh was seen as someone who might be able to negotiate with the communists. But the North Vietnamese had no interest in negotiations. They smelled total victory, and they were going to take it. As North Vietnamese forces closed in on Saigon, the American embassy organized a desperate evacuation. Thousands of Americans remained in South Vietnam, along with tens of thousands of Vietnamese who had worked for the Americans or the South Vietnamese government, and feared communist reprisals. Ambassador Graham Martin had resisted calls for early evacuation, hoping against hope that somehow the situation could be salvaged. But by mid-April, even he recognized that Saigon would fall. The problem was how to evacuate without causing total panic. The plan was to use commercial and military aircraft to fly people out from Tan Son Nut Air Base. But on April 28th, North Vietnamese artillery shelled the airport, destroying aircraft and making it too dangerous for large-scale fixed-wing evacuation. The only option left was Operation Frequent Wind, a helicopter evacuation from various points in the city, including the embassy. On April 29, 1975, the evacuation began in earnest. The signal was the playing of Bing Crosby's White Christmas on Armed Forces Radio, followed by the announcement that the temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising. Helicopters began shuttling between Saigon and ships of the 7th Fleet positioned off the coast. The evacuation was supposed to be orderly, but chaos quickly ensued. Thousands of Vietnamese converged on evacuation points. Many had been promised evacuation but had no documentation. Others simply showed up hoping to escape. At the embassy, the gates were stormed by desperate crowds. Marines used tear gas and rifle butts to control the mob. Embassy staff and some Vietnamese were evacuated from the roof by helicopter in scenes that would become iconic symbols of American defeat. The helicopters flew mission after mission through the night and into the next day. Over 7,000 people were evacuated by helicopter, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. The scenes at the embassy were desperate and tragic. As the last helicopters prepared to leave, thousands of Vietnamese who had gathered in the compound realized they would be left behind. Some climbed the embassy walls trying to reach the roof. Others pushed toward the helicopters. Marine guards held them back. The final helicopter, carrying Ambassador Martin, lifted off from the embassy roof in the early morning hours of April 30th. Vietnamese employees who had worked for the Americans for years were left behind, their promises of evacuation unfulfilled. Many would face harsh punishment in the years that followed. The fall of Saigon was not just a military defeat, it was a moral catastrophe, a betrayal of promises made to people who had trusted America. The images of helicopters lifting off while desperate people below reached upward would haunt America for decades. At the same time, scenes of desperation were playing out across Saigon. South Vietnamese pilots commandeered aircraft and flew them out to sea, landing on American ships or ditching in the ocean. Entire families crowded into small boats and headed out to sea, hoping to be rescued by American ships. Some made it. Many did not. At the presidential palace, the South Vietnamese government waited for the end. On the morning of April 30th, North Vietnamese tanks smashed through the palace gates. A North Vietnamese soldier ran up the palace steps and planted the Viet Cong flag. General Minh attempted to surrender, but the North Vietnamese officer who accepted his surrender told him that he could not surrender what he did not control. The war was over. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam had won. South Vietnam ceased to exist. The fall of Saigon sent shockwaves around the world. For America, it was the first clear defeat in its history. American military power, which had seemed invincible, had been unable to prevent a small communist nation from conquering an American ally. The credibility of American commitments was called into question. If America abandoned South Vietnam after 20 years and 58,000 American lives, what did that say about American reliability? Allies in Europe and Asia worried about whether they could count on American support if they were threatened. For the communist world, Vietnam was a tremendous victory. David had defeated Goliath. A third world liberation movement had beaten the world's greatest superpower. The lessons of Vietnam, that determined guerrilla forces could defeat technologically superior opponents, would inspire insurgencies around the world. For the Vietnamese people, reunification brought an end to decades of war, but it also brought harsh repression. The victorious communists were not merciful. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers, officials, and professionals were sent to re-education camps where they endured years of hard labor, indoctrination, and abuse. Many died in these camps. The new government collectivized agriculture and nationalized businesses, causing economic disruption and hardship. Political dissent was not tolerated. The promise of liberation gave way to the reality of authoritarian communist rule. Over the next decade, more than 1 million Vietnamese would flee the country as boat people, risking death at sea rather than live under the new regime. Many drowned or were killed by pirates. Those who survived often spent years in refugee camps before being resettled in other countries. The cost of the Vietnam War was staggering. Over 3 million Vietnamese died, both military and civilian, from north and south. The country was devastated. Cities had been destroyed by bombing. The countryside was pockmarked with bomb craters and contaminated with unexploded ordnance and chemical defoliants. The infrastructure was in ruins. The economy was shattered. It would take decades for Vietnam to recover. For America, 58,000 soldiers had died. Over 300,000 were wounded. The financial cost exceeded $150 billion, equivalent to over $1 trillion today. But the costs that could not be measured in dollars or casualties were perhaps even greater. The war had divided American society, destroyed faith in government, and traumatized a generation. Veterans returned home to a country that did not welcome them, that sometimes scorned them, that wanted to forget the war they had fought. Many struggled with physical and psychological wounds that would never fully heal. The fall of Saigon marked the end of the war, but not the end of its impact. The war would continue to shape American politics, culture, and foreign policy for decades. The Vietnam Syndrome, the reluctance to commit American forces abroad for fear of another quagmire, would influence American decision-making through the end of the century. The divisions the war created, between hawks and doves, between those who served and those who protested, between generations, would persist and evolve but never fully heal. Vietnam became a touchstone, a reference point for debates about American power and responsibility. For every subsequent conflict, the question was asked, is this another Vietnam? The answer to that question shaped how America engaged with the world. The fall of Saigon was not just the end of a war. It was the end of an era of American confidence and idealism, replaced by doubt, cynicism, and a hard-won wisdom about the limits of American power. The Vietnam War ended in April 1975, but for millions of people, the suffering was just beginning. American veterans came home to a country that did not know how to receive them. Unlike soldiers returning from previous wars who were greeted as heroes with parades and celebrations, Vietnam veterans often returned to indifference or even hostility. Many anti-war protesters saw the soldiers as complicit in an immoral war. Stories circulated, some true and some exaggerated, of veterans being spat upon and called baby killers. Whether these incidents were as widespread as later claimed is debatable, but the perception that veterans were not welcomed home was real and deeply painful. Most veterans simply came home quietly, took off their uniforms, and tried to blend back into civilian life. They found a country that wanted to forget the war and did not want to hear about their experiences. The psychological toll on veterans was immense. Many suffered from what was then called shell shock or combat fatigue, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. The symptoms included flashbacks, nightmares, anxiety, depression, emotional numbness, and difficulty maintaining relationships. For many veterans, the transition from the hypervigilance required in combat to the mundane routines of civilian life was impossible to make. They could not sleep. They could not hold jobs. They turned to alcohol and drugs to numb the pain. Suicide rates among Vietnam veterans were alarmingly high. The Veterans Administration was ill-equipped to deal with the scale of the problem. Mental health services were inadequate. Many veterans felt abandoned by the country they had served. They had been sent to fight a war that the country had turned against, and now they were expected to simply move on as if nothing had happened. The physical toll was also severe. Thousands of veterans were permanently disabled by their wounds. Some had lost limbs, others suffered from traumatic brain injuries. Many had been exposed to Agent Orange and other chemical defoliants and would later develop cancers, neurological disorders, and other illnesses. The government was slow to acknowledge the connection between Agent Orange exposure and these health problems, and it took years of activism by veterans groups to force the VA to provide adequate care and compensation. The children of veterans exposed to Agent Orange also suffered higher rates of birth defects and health problems, meaning the war's legacy was being passed to the next generation. The physical and psychological scars of the war marked not just individuals but entire families and communities. The Vietnamese people bore an even heavier burden. Those who had supported the South Vietnamese government or worked with Americans faced persecution under the new communist regime. The re-education camps were brutal. Inmates were subjected to hard labor, malnutrition, disease, and constant ideological indoctrination. They were forced to confess their crimes against the people and denounce their former lives. Many spent years in these camps. Some never emerged. Those who were released found that they were marked as enemies of the state. Unable to find decent work, their children denied educational opportunities. The message was clear. There was no place in the new Vietnam for those who had opposed the revolution. The promised reconciliation turned out to be revenge dressed in ideological language. The economic policies of the unified Vietnam under communist rule proved disastrous. The collectivization of agriculture and the nationalization of businesses destroyed the productive capacity of the South. In the North, the economy had never been robust, sustained primarily by Soviet and Chinese aid. Now, with the need to rebuild the entire country and integrate the South into the communist system, the economic challenges were overwhelming. Food shortages became common. Inflation was rampant. The black market was the only way many people could obtain basic necessities. The government's attempt to impose a rigid communist economic system on a population that had lived under capitalism created widespread suffering and drove hundreds of thousands to flee. The boat people crisis that began in the late 1970s was a direct result of the new regime's policies and repression. The boat people were refugees who fled Vietnam by sea in small, often unseaworthy vessels. They included former South Vietnamese soldiers and officials, ethnic Chinese who faced particular persecution, and ordinary people who simply could not bear to live under communist rule. The journey was extraordinarily dangerous. Boats were overcrowded and poorly provisioned. Many sank in storms or from being overloaded. Pirates in the Gulf of Thailand preyed on refugees, robbing, raping, and murdering them. Some estimates suggest that between 20 and 40% of boat people died at sea. Those who survived often spent months or years in squalid refugee camps in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. Eventually, about 800,000 boat people were resettled in the United States, with hundreds of thousands more going to Canada, Australia, France, and other countries. They carried with them the trauma of war, the pain of displacement, and the challenge of rebuilding their lives in unfamiliar lands. In the United States, the end of the war did not bring closure or healing. Instead, it opened bitter debates about what had gone wrong and who was to blame. Some argued that the war had been winnable if only politicians had let the military fight without restrictions. If only the American people had maintained their will, if only the anti-war movement had not undermined the war effort. This stab-in-the-back narrative suggested that America had not really lost the war, it had given up on victory. Others argued that the war had been fundamentally flawed from the start, that it was based on misunderstandings of Vietnamese history and nationalism, that no amount of military force could have created a stable, democratic South Vietnam when the government was corrupt and the people did not support it. These debates were not merely historical, they reflected deeper disagreements about American power, about the proper role of dissent in wartime, and about the lessons to be learned for future conflicts. The divisions created by the war permeated American culture and politics. The 1970s and 80s saw these divisions play out in elections, with veterans and military issues becoming political flashpoints. The question of whether someone had served in Vietnam, and how they had served, became politically relevant in ways that would have seemed bizarre in earlier eras. Bill Clinton's avoidance of the draft became a major issue in his presidential campaigns. George H.W. Bush's World War II service was contrasted with his opponent's lack of military experience. John Kerry's Vietnam service and his subsequent anti-war activism were both used as weapons in the 2004 presidential campaign. The war that had ended in 1975 continued to be fought in American politics for decades. Hollywood struggled with how to portray the war. Early films like The Green Berets, starring John Wayne, had portrayed Vietnam as a noble cause, a fight against communist aggression. But after the war ended, a wave of darker, more complex films emerged. The Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now, Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, and later films like Born on the 4th of July explored the horror, absurdity, and moral complexity of the war. These films did not celebrate the war or those who fought it, but neither did they simply condemn them. They tried to grapple with the impossible situations soldiers faced, with the way war dehumanizes everyone it touches, with the gulf between official rhetoric and ground truth. These films became part of how Americans understood the war, shaping memory and discourse in ways that history books could not. The impact of Vietnam on American foreign policy was profound. The Vietnam Syndrome, the reluctance to commit American forces abroad, influenced American decision-making for a generation. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, President George H.W. Bush was explicit about the need to overcome the Vietnam Syndrome. The Gulf War, with its limited objectives, overwhelming force, and quick victory, was seen as exercising the ghost of Vietnam. But the syndrome returned during debates about intervention in Bosnia, Somalia, and other conflicts throughout the 1990s. The fundamental questions raised by Vietnam, about when and where America should use military force, about how to fight wars with limited objectives, about the relationship between military means and political ends, remained unresolved. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 21st century would once again raise these questions. With many observers drawing explicit parallels to Vietnam, the legacy of the war also included important changes to American institutions and laws. The War Powers Resolution of 1973, passed over Nixon's veto, was a direct response to the Vietnam War and the belief that presidents had usurped Congress's constitutional authority to declare war. The resolution required presidents to consult with Congress before committing troops and limited how long troops could remain in combat without congressional authorization. Whether the resolution has been effective in preventing future Vietnams is debatable. Presidents of both parties have often ignored or worked around it, but it represented an attempt to restore constitutional balance and prevent the kind of incremental escalation that had characterized Vietnam. The Freedom of Information Act was strengthened in part because of lessons learned from government secrecy during Vietnam. The Pentagon Papers and other revelations had shown how the government had systematically deceived the public. Reforms were intended to make government more transparent and accountable. The environmental damage caused by the war also continued for decades. The use of Agent Orange and other defoliants contaminated vast areas of Vietnam with dioxin, a toxic chemical that persists in soil and water. Even today, decades after the war ended, dioxin contamination remains a serious problem in parts of Vietnam, causing health problems and birth defects in areas that were heavily sprayed. Unexploded ordnance, including millions of landmines and bombs that failed to detonate, continue to kill and maim Vietnamese people. Children find bombs while playing or farmers hit them while plowing fields. The work of clearing unexploded ordnance is slow and dangerous and will take many more decades to complete. The war's environmental legacy is a reminder that the consequences of conflict extend far beyond the battlefield and far beyond the lives of combatants. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the Vietnam War was its effect on American self-perception. Before Vietnam, Americans generally believed that their country was fundamentally good, that American power was a force for good in the world, and that America did not lose wars. Vietnam shattered these beliefs. Americans learned that their government had lied to them repeatedly about the war. They learned that American military power had limits. They learned that the United States could fight a long war and lose. They learned that sometimes there are no good options, only choices between different kinds of failure. This loss of innocence, this realization that America was not always on the right side and did not always win, was traumatic for the national psyche. It led to a period of introspection and self-doubt that some saw as healthy realism and others saw as dangerous weakness. But it fundamentally changed how Americans thought about their country and its role in the world. For the Vietnamese people, both North and South, the legacy was even more complex. The communist government portrayed the war as a glorious victory of the Vietnamese people over American imperialism. The war was commemorated in museums, monuments, and official histories that celebrated heroes of the resistance and martyrs who died for independence. But this official narrative obscured the terrible costs the Vietnamese people had paid, the millions of dead, the families torn apart, the country devastated. It also obscured the complexity of the war, the fact that it was as much a civil war as a war against foreign intervention, that millions of Vietnamese in the South had genuinely opposed communism and fought against the North. The official history had no place for their stories, their sacrifices, their suffering. They became non-persons in the new Vietnam, written out of history. Only gradually, as the communist government relaxed its grip and as a new generation emerged without personal memory of the war, did it become possible to acknowledge the war's full complexity and tragedy. The path to reconciliation between the United States and Vietnam was long and difficult, hampered by bitterness, mistrust, and domestic politics on both sides. In the years immediately after the fall of Saigon, relations between the two countries were frozen. The United States refused to recognize the unified Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Trade was embargoed. Diplomatic contact was minimal. The Vietnamese government's harsh treatment of former South Vietnamese allies and its economic mismanagement reinforced American views that the communist regime was brutal and illegitimate. For many Americans, particularly veterans and the families of those who had died, Vietnam represented a painful chapter they wanted to close, not revisit. The idea of normal relations with a country that had defeated America seemed impossible. The situation was complicated by the POW MIA issue, the question of American prisoners of war and missing in action personnel. By the end of the war, the United States listed over 2,500 servicemen as missing in action. Some were known to have died, their bodies not recovered. Others disappeared in circumstances where their fate was uncertain. Some Americans believed that prisoners might still be held in Vietnam, that men were being kept in secret camps. These beliefs were fueled by reported sightings, dubious photographs, and the Vietnamese government's slowness in cooperating with American efforts to account for the missing. The POW MIA issue became emotionally charged and politically sensitive. The black POW MIA flag, bearing the words "You are not forgotten," flew at government buildings and became a symbol of the belief that America had abandoned its soldiers. While there was no credible evidence that Americans were still being held prisoner after 1973, the Vietnamese government's reluctance to fully cooperate in accounting for the missing kept the issue alive and prevented progress toward normal relations. Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia in December 1978 and its subsequent 10-year occupation further poisoned relations. The invasion was motivated by border disputes and by the brutal attacks of the Khmer Rouge regime on Vietnamese villages. But it was also an assertion of Vietnamese dominance in Indochina. The invasion toppled the genocidal Khmer Rouge regime, which should have been welcomed, but it was condemned internationally as aggression. The United States sided with China in opposing Vietnam, leading to the strange situation where America effectively supported the Khmer Rouge, one of history's most murderous regimes, in exile because they were fighting against Vietnam. The Cold War logic of opposing Soviet-lined Vietnam trumped moral considerations about the Khmer Rouge's crimes. This period represented perhaps the nadir of US-Vietnam relations, with both countries viewing each other with deep hostility. The end of the Cold War changed the geopolitical landscape with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Vietnam lost its primary patron and source of aid. The Vietnamese economy, already struggling under the weight of communist mismanagement and the costs of the Cambodia occupation, faced crisis. The Vietnamese government began implementing Doi Moi, a policy of economic renovation that introduced market reforms while maintaining Communist Party political control. It was similar to China's reforms a decade earlier, a recognition that rigid communist economics had failed. As Vietnam opened to foreign investment and normalized relations with other countries, the question of relations with the United States became more pressing. Trade with America could transform Vietnam's economy. For the United States, a stable and prosperous Vietnam integrated into the global economy was preferable to an isolated and embittered one. The election of Bill Clinton in 1992 opened new possibilities. Clinton had avoided the draft during Vietnam, which made him controversial among veterans but also meant he was not personally invested in the old animosities. He was willing to look forward rather than backward. In 1993, Clinton lifted the trade embargo against Vietnam. In 1994, he announced that the United States would normalize diplomatic relations. The decision was controversial. Many veterans groups and POW MIA families opposed it, arguing that Vietnam had not done enough to account for missing Americans. Senator John McCain, himself a former POW who had been held and tortured in Hanoi, supported normalization, arguing that it was time to move forward and that normal relations would actually help in resolving the POW-MA issue. In 1995, the United States and Vietnam established full diplomatic relations. 20 years after the war ended, the normalization process accelerated through the late 1990s and into the 21st century. Trade between the two countries grew rapidly. American companies invested in Vietnam, taking advantage of its low-cost labor and growing consumer market. Vietnamese exports to the United States increased dramatically, with Vietnam becoming a major source of textiles, electronics, and agricultural products. In 2000, Clinton became the first American president to visit Vietnam since the war, a symbolic moment of reconciliation. He met with Vietnamese leaders, visited Hanoi, and spoke to students about democracy and human rights. The visit demonstrated how far relations had come, though significant differences remained on political issues. At home in America, the process of coming to terms with the Vietnam War continued through memorials and commemorations. The most powerful of these was the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., dedicated in 1982. The memorial, designed by Maya Lin when she was a 21-year-old architecture student, was controversial when first proposed. Its stark black granite wall, inscribed with the names of the dead, set into the earth rather than rising above it, seemed to some to be too somber, insufficiently heroic. Some veterans wanted a more traditional monument celebrating their service, but the memorial's power came from its simplicity and its focus on individual loss. The 58,000 names inscribed on the wall transformed abstract casualty statistics into individual human beings. Each name represented a life, a family, a story. Visitors could touch the names, make rubbings, leave mementos. The memorial became a place of pilgrimage, healing, and remembrance. It changed how Americans thought about memorials and about the war. Other memorials followed. The three servicemen statue, added near the wall in 1984, depicted three soldiers, one white, one black, one Hispanic, in a more traditional representational style. The Vietnam Women's Memorial, dedicated in 1993, honored the thousands of American women, mostly nurses, who served in Vietnam. These additions reflected the diversity of those who served and the different forms their service took. In communities across America, local memorials were erected honoring those from their towns and cities who had died in Vietnam. Schools, bridges, and buildings were named after the fallen. These acts of remembrance served multiple purposes. They honored the dead, they acknowledged the sacrifice of those who served, and they allowed communities to process their grief and find meaning in loss. The work of accounting for the missing continued, facilitated by improved relations between the two countries. Joint American-Vietnamese teams conducted searches in areas where aircraft had crashed or where soldiers were known to have disappeared. Advances in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, made it possible to identify remains that would have been unidentifiable in earlier decades. Slowly, the number of unaccounted-for personnel decreased. Families who had lived for decades without knowing what happened to their loved ones finally received answers and could hold funerals and find closure. By 2020, the number of unaccounted-for personnel had been reduced to about 1,500, and the work continued. While the uncertainty was painful, the ongoing effort demonstrated a commitment not to forget those who were lost. Veterans organizations also played a crucial role in healing and advocacy. Groups like Vietnam Veterans of America, founded in 1978, fought for better health care and benefits for veterans, pushed for recognition of the effects of Agent Orange, and worked to ensure that the experiences and lessons of Vietnam were not forgotten. These organizations provided community for veterans who often felt isolated in civilian society. They organized reunions where veterans could connect with those who shared their experiences. They created programs to help veterans struggling with PTSD, addiction, and other challenges, and they worked to educate the public about the war and about the needs of veterans. The motto never again took on dual meanings. Never again should America fight a war like Vietnam, and never again should veterans be treated as Vietnam veterans were treated when they came home. In Vietnam, the process of coming to terms with the war was different but equally complex. For decades, the official narrative emphasized the heroic struggle against American imperialism and the glorious victory of the Vietnamese people. Museums displayed captured American equipment. Tours took visitors to the Cu Chi tunnels where Viet Cong fighters had lived underground. The War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City, formerly Saigon, displayed graphic images of war atrocities and the effects of Agent Orange. The narrative was one of victimization and ultimate triumph. But this narrative left out much of the complexity and tragedy of the war. It ignored the suffering of South Vietnamese who had fought against the North. It downplayed the enormous casualties the North had sustained. It glossed over the harsh policies and repression that followed reunification. As Vietnam opened to the world and as a new generation grew up without personal memory of the war, space emerged for more nuanced discussions. Vietnamese writers, filmmakers, and artists began exploring the war's complexity, sometimes pushing the boundaries of what the communist government found acceptable. The war was portrayed not just as a glorious victory but as a tragedy that had devastated the entire country. Stories emerged of soldiers from both sides who had fought bravely, suffered terribly, and were haunted by their experiences. The human cost of the war, not just the political victory, became a subject that could be discussed. This evolution was gradual and incomplete. The communist government still controlled the narrative and censored views it found threatening. But the opening was real, reflecting a society's need to process collective trauma. The relationship between American and Vietnamese veterans proved surprisingly healing for some. Programs brought former enemies together to share their experiences and find common ground in their shared suffering. American veterans traveled back to Vietnam, not as conquerors or tourists but as pilgrims seeking closure. They visited battlefields where they had fought, sometimes meeting Vietnamese veterans who had fought against them. These encounters were often emotional and cathartic. Former enemies discovered their common humanity, their shared experience of fear and loss, their mutual desire for peace. Not all veterans could or wanted to participate in such reconciliations, and for some the wounds were too deep ever to heal. But for others, these encounters provided a path toward forgiveness and understanding that had seemed impossible. The 50th anniversary of major events in the war, marked in the 2010s, prompted renewed reflection on the war's meaning and legacy. Documentaries, books, and exhibitions examined the war from multiple perspectives. Ken Burns's documentary series The Vietnam War, broadcast in 2017, presented the war through the voices of soldiers and civilians from all sides, American and Vietnamese, North and South. The series reached millions of viewers and sparked widespread discussion. It reminded a new generation of the war's tragedy and complexity while providing a forum for veterans and Vietnamese people to share their stories. The documentary, like the war itself, was received differently by different audiences. Some saw it as finally telling the full truth, others felt it still missed important perspectives. But it demonstrated the continuing need to grapple with the war's legacy. The lessons of Vietnam remain contested and relevant. For American foreign policy makers, Vietnam is both a warning and a puzzle. The warning is clear: do not fight wars without clear objectives, public support, and an understanding of local conditions. Do not assume that military might can solve political problems. Do not underestimate the determination of opponents fighting on their own soil for causes they believe in. But the puzzle is what to do with this knowledge. Some have taken the lesson that America should avoid military interventions altogether. Others argue that Vietnam's lessons have been overlearned, that they have made America too hesitant to use its power when it should. The debate continues with every new conflict, every decision about whether and how to use American military force. Vietnam haunts these debates not as a simple lesson but as a cautionary tale whose full meaning remains elusive. The Vietnam War was more than just a military conflict that America lost. It was a transformative event that fundamentally altered American society, politics, and culture in ways that continue to reverberate today. To understand modern America, you must understand Vietnam. The war shattered the Cold War consensus that had dominated American politics since World War II. Before Vietnam, there was broad agreement across the political spectrum that America needed to contain communism globally, that American military power should be used to support allies and oppose communist expansion, and that American presidents should have wide latitude to conduct foreign policy and military operations. Vietnam destroyed this consensus. The left turned against interventionism, questioning whether American power was a force for good in the world. The right became divided between those who believed the war proved the dangers of limited war and those who wanted to avoid foreign entanglements altogether. This fracturing of consensus has never been repaired. The war also fundamentally changed the relationship between the American people and their government. The credibility gap, the systematic deception by multiple administrations about the war's progress and prospects, destroyed trust in government that has never been fully restored. Before Vietnam, most Americans trusted that their government was telling them the truth, that officials acted in good faith, that the system worked. After Vietnam and the Watergate scandal that followed directly from it, such trust seemed naive. The assumption became that government officials lie, that official explanations are propaganda, that the truth must be uncovered through investigative journalism and leaked documents. This cynicism has had profound effects on American democracy. It has made it harder for any government to conduct foreign policy with public support. It has contributed to political polarization as different sides believe different narratives about what the government is really doing. And it has fed conspiracy theories and distrusts of institutions across the political spectrum. The war transformed the American military itself. The defeat in Vietnam, combined with the social turmoil within the ranks during the war, led to a complete reconceptualization of the American military. The draft was ended in 1973, replaced with an all-volunteer force. This change was motivated partly by the belief that draftees had been unreliable in Vietnam, and partly by the political calculation that ending the draft would reduce anti-war sentiment. The all-volunteer force has been successful in creating a more professional military, but it has also created a civil-military divide. Most Americans have no direct connection to the military. Military service has become concentrated in certain families, regions, and demographic groups. This divide means that decisions to go to war do not affect most Americans directly, which some argue makes such decisions easier to make and harder to reverse. The military also learned tactical and operational lessons from Vietnam. The development of counterinsurgency doctrine, the emphasis on special operations forces, the integration of air and ground operations, all reflected lessons learned in Vietnam. But perhaps the most important military lesson was the Powell Doctrine, articulated by General Colin Powell, who had served 2 tours in Vietnam. The doctrine held that military force should be used only when vital national interests are at stake, when there are clear and achievable objectives, when overwhelming force can be applied, when there is a reasonable expectation of public and congressional support, and when there is a clear exit strategy. These criteria were explicitly designed to prevent another Vietnam. They guided American military thinking through the Gulf War and beyond, though their application in Iraq and Afghanistan proved problematic. Vietnam taught the military to be cautious about limited wars with vague objectives, but the lesson was repeatedly forgotten or ignored. Vietnam also catalyzed changes in media and journalism. Television coverage of the war, bringing images of combat and suffering into American living rooms every evening, changed how Americans experienced war. The relatively uncensored reporting, at least in the war's early years, showed Americans things that previous generations had been shielded from. This led to debates about the media's role in the war's outcome. Some argued that negative media coverage turned the public against a war that could have been won. Others argued that the media simply reported the truth that the government was hiding. These debates continue today. But what is clear is that Vietnam changed the relationship between the military, the government, and the media. Subsequent conflicts have seen much tighter control of media access and messaging, reflecting lessons learned from Vietnam about the power of images and narratives. The anti-war movement that grew during Vietnam established templates for activism that continue to be used. The tactics of mass demonstrations, civil disobedience, teach-ins, and grassroots organizing pioneered or perfected during the Vietnam era have been adopted by movements across the political spectrum. The Vietnam anti-war movement also demonstrated that sustained public pressure could change government policy. Even during wartime, this was a profound lesson for democracy. On the other hand, the divisiveness and sometimes violence associated with Vietnam-era protests also created backlash and contributed to political polarization that persists. The culture wars that dominate American politics today have roots in the conflicts of the Vietnam era. The divide between those who protested the war and those who supported it, between countercultural values and traditional values, between different visions of patriotism and national identity, these divisions emerged or intensified during Vietnam and have never been resolved. The war's impact on American culture was pervasive. Rock music became a vehicle for protest and social commentary. Songs like Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival, War by Edwin Starr, and Give Peace a Chance by John Lennon became anthems of the anti-war movement. The counterculture that emerged in the 1960s, with its rejection of mainstream values, its experimentation with drugs and alternative lifestyles, was intimately connected to opposition to the war. The war accelerated generational conflict, with young people questioning the values and decisions of their parents' generation. This generational divide transformed American culture, from attitudes about authority to gender roles to the role of government. Fashion, language, art, all were influenced by the rebellion against the establishment that the war kept. The women's movement also drew energy and lessons from the Vietnam era. Many women who became active in the anti-war movement experienced sexism and marginalization within the movement, which radicalized them and led to the emergence of second-wave feminism. The civil rights movement's evolution toward more radical black power politics was also connected to Vietnam. The hypocrisy of asking black Americans to fight for freedom in Vietnam when they did not have full freedom at home was not lost on civil rights leaders. Muhammad Ali's refusal to serve became a defining moment. The connection between the war abroad and injustice at home became a central theme of progressive politics, a connection that continues to this day. For international relations, Vietnam had lasting effects. The defeat damaged American credibility and prestige. Allies questioned whether America would stand by its commitments. Adversaries were emboldened. The Soviet Union increased its activities in the Third World, supporting communist movements and governments in Angola, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, and elsewhere. The Vietnam Syndrome made America hesitant to intervene militarily, which some argued created a vacuum that adversaries exploited. The war also contributed to the decline of American economic dominance. The enormous cost of the war, combined with President Johnson's refusal to raise taxes adequately to pay for it, contributed to inflation and economic problems in the 1970s. The guns and butter approach, trying to fight the war while maintaining domestic spending on Great Society programs, proved economically unsustainable. Vietnam also reshaped international law and norms about intervention and sovereignty. The war raised questions about when intervention in another country's affairs is legitimate, about the responsibility to protect civilians, about the ethics of supporting authoritarian allies, about the use of weapons like napalm and cluster bombs. These debates influenced the development of international humanitarian law and the concepts of human rights that emerged in the decades after Vietnam. The war served as a cautionary tale about the limits of military power and the importance of understanding local conditions. Lessons that were repeatedly cited during debates about subsequent interventions in places like Bosnia, Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. For Vietnam itself, the war's legacy is omnipresent. The country is young, with over half the population born after reunification, but the war still shapes national identity. The government uses the war to legitimize its rule, portraying the Communist Party as the liberator of the nation from foreign domination. Historical sites related to the war are major tourist attractions. Veterans of the war hold honored positions in society. Though many struggle with poverty and neglect, the environmental damage from Agent Orange and unexploded ordnance continues to affect people's lives. Birth defects linked to dioxin contamination still occur. Children still die from stepping on mines. The war's physical legacy will remain for generations. Economically, Vietnam has transformed itself into one of the fastest-growing economies in Asia, embracing market reforms while maintaining Communist Party control. The country that America fought to keep from falling to communism has become a major trading partner and, increasingly, a strategic partner in America's efforts to balance China's power in Asia. The irony is not lost on observers. The refugee communities that formed after the war, particularly the large Vietnamese American population in the United States, carry their own complex relationship with the war. For many refugees, the war never truly ended. They preserve the memory of South Vietnam, displayed the yellow flag with 3 red stripes that was the South's flag, and commemorate fallen South Vietnamese soldiers. Their narrative of the war, of fighting against communist aggression and being betrayed by America's abandonment, differs from both the American mainstream narrative and from the narrative in Vietnam today. These communities have contributed enormously to American society while maintaining strong connections to Vietnamese culture. They represent a diaspora shaped by war, displacement, and the challenge of belonging to 2 worlds simultaneously. The question of whether the Vietnam War was worth fighting continues to be debated. Those who argue it was point to the domino theory's partial validation. When South Vietnam fell, Cambodia and Laos also fell to communism, and the Khmer Rouge's genocide followed. They argued that the war bought time for other Southeast Asian countries to develop and strengthen, preventing a wider communist takeover. They point to the suffering of those who lived under communist rule as justification for the attempt to prevent it. Those who argue the war was not worth fighting point to the enormous costs in lives, money, and social division weighed against the failure to achieve the objective. They argue that the war was based on misunderstandings of Vietnamese nationalism and that no amount of American intervention could have created a viable, popular, non-communist government in South Vietnam. They argue that the costs outweighed any conceivable benefits. Perhaps the most honest answer is that Vietnam taught America that there are limits to its power, that good intentions are not enough, that understanding the local context is essential, that public support is necessary for sustained military commitments, and that sometimes there are no good options, only choices between different kinds of failure. These lessons should have been obvious from history, but America had to learn them through painful experience. Whether America has truly internalized these lessons remains an open question. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan raised many of the same issues and challenges as Vietnam, suggesting that the lessons may need to be relearned by each generation. The Vietnam War changed everything because it shattered American certainty. Before Vietnam, America believed it was exceptional, destined for greatness, always on the right side of history, invincible in war. After Vietnam, those beliefs were tempered by the reality of limits, failures, and moral ambiguity. Some see this as a tragic loss of national confidence. Others see it as a necessary maturation, a recognition that America is a great power but not an omnipotent one, that it can do enormous good in the world but can also cause enormous harm. This tension between American idealism and American power, between the aspiration to spread freedom and democracy and the reality of the costs and consequences of intervention, defines American foreign policy today. Vietnam is the lens through which America still views itself and its role in the world. The war that ended in 1975 continues to shape how America understands itself, how it exercises power, how it relates to the world, and how its citizens relate to their government and to each other. In that sense, Vietnam never really ended. Its legacy lives on, a permanent part of the American experience, a reminder of both the power and the limits of American might, a cautionary tale whose warnings remain urgent and whose lessons remain imperfectly learned.